I showed up unannounced at Nolan and Amber's place, a sprawling modern colonial tucked inside a gated community in Westlake, Ohio, on Thanksgiving Day. My 7-year-old grandson was out on the patio, shivering in a t-shirt and shorts in that atrocious cold. Through the glass, the whole family sat around the holiday table, warm and laughing, wine glasses raised. I picked up a heavy ceramic planter and put it through the sliding door. Then, I carried that freezing child inside. The security alarm was screaming. I turned to my son and I said 6 words. The color left his face entirely. "Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today." If these stories about family loyalty and fighting for what's right speak to something in you, it means a great deal when you subscribe and leave a like. It lets me know to keep telling them. And before we begin, I'd love to know, what are you doing right now? While you listen, cooking, driving, taking a quiet break. Drop it in the comments. A quick note. Some scenes and details in this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is coincidental. What matters is the truth at the center of it. A quick note, some details in this story have been shaped for the purposes of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific individuals or events is purely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. My own foundation cracked at 6 o'clock on Thanksgiving morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of black coffee when my phone buzzed an automated fraud alert. $15,000 had just been wired out of the medical trust fund I had established for my 7-year-old grandson, Owen. The authorization note attached to that withdrawal had been typed by my son, Nolan. It read, "Emergency winter respiratory therapy." Owen was born with severe asthma, a condition requiring daily medication and constant vigilance. I had built that trust for a single purpose, so my grandson would never struggle to breathe because his parents ran short on money. But a $15,000 emergency withdrawal on a national holiday made no sense at all. Clinics were closed. Specialists were sitting at their own holiday tables. I called Nolan immediately, straight to voicemail. I tried again, voicemail a second time. I tried his wife, Amber. The phone rang twice before she manually pushed me to a machine. My chest tightened. Not the frantic, helpless panic of a worried grandfather, the cold, deliberate dread of an engineer who has just spotted a catastrophic flaw in the structure. I left no message. I did not sit by the phone. I grabbed my keys, pulled on my heavy winter coat, and stepped out into the freezing sleet. The drive from Clifton's home in Columbus, Ohio, to their suburb stretched 4 hours. The roads were coated in ice. The sky hung low and bruised an unbroken gray ceiling. The windshield wipers beat a slow, punishing rhythm that matched the pounding building behind my eyes. I dialed Nolan's number every 30 minutes. Each ignored call stripped away another layer of restraint. By the 3rd hour, my worry over Owen's breathing had curdled into something far colder, a gnawing, bone-deep suspicion. Nolan had been manufacturing financial excuses for months. Back in August, he'd come to me for a personal loan, claiming his roof urgently needed replacing. I drove out to look for myself and found the shingles in the perfect shape. I denied the loan. Ever since, my son had treated me like something to be avoided, keeping Owen at arm's length, trimming our phone calls down to rushed 5-minute obligations. The $15,000 gone from that trust was not buying oxygen for my grandson. I knew it in my gut, and I intended to find out exactly what it was buying. I left my truck 2 blocks from the house. I wanted no headlights, no engine noise to signal my arrival. The temperature had sunk to 8 degrees Celsius. The wind knifed through the bare trees, cutting straight through my denim jeans and coat. I made my way down the ice sidewalk, boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. Nolan and Amber's place, a sprawling modern colonial inside a gated community in Westlake, Ohio, sat behind expensive walls on an expensive lot. What they had conveniently forgotten, and what I had never bothered to remind them of, was that my money had secured their mortgage. I had covered their substantial down payment under a private agreement, quietly keeping the deed tied to my name as a safeguard against their reckless habits. I came around to the property from the side gate, planning to knock on the back door and demand a full accounting. But as I cleared the corner of the privacy fence, my blood turned to ice. My grandson Owen was locked out on the back patio. He wore nothing but a thin cotton t-shirt and summer shorts. The boy was wedged into the corner, knees pulled hard to his chest, shaking so violently his small frame shuddered against the brick wall. His bare feet were flat against the frost. I broke into a run. Ice be damned. When I reached him and dropped to my knees, Owen's lips had gone a terrifying shade of blue. His skin was pale, nearly translucent, and cold as stone to the touch. He looked up at me, eyes wide and glassy. All focus gone. He tried to say my name, but his jaw was locked, his teeth rattling too hard to form the word. I peeled off my heavy coat and wrapped it completely around his small, frozen body. Through the wide sliding glass doors of the dining room, I saw the source of this nightmare. The interior glowed with warm golden light. A massive roasted turkey dominated the center of a long, mahogany table. Nolan was pouring red wine. Amber was laughing, head thrown back. Seated across from them were Amber's parents, Burton and Claudette, draped in expensive cashmere and raising crystal glasses for a holiday toast. They were eating. They were drinking. They were warm. And my grandson was freezing to death fewer than 20 feet away. I hammered my fist on the glass, screaming Nolan's name. Not one of them turned. The double-paned, heavily insulated glass swallowed both the wind and my voice completely. The patio door handle was locked from inside. A searing, uncontrollable rage took hold in my chest. I did not hesitate. I grabbed a heavy ceramic planter from the edge of the patio, hoisted it above my head, and drove it straight into the center of the sliding glass door. The glass exploded with a deafening crash, raining sharp fragments across the hardwood floor inside. The home security alarm triggered instantly, a piercing, high-pitched siren, shrieking out across the neighborhood. I kicked away the remaining jagged shards from the frame, scooped Owen up into my arms, and stepped through that ruined doorway into their pristine dining room. Nolan dropped his wine bottle. The red liquid bled across the white linen tablecloth like an open wound. Amber shrieked, leaping from her chair and clutching her chest. Burton and Claudette froze. The arrogant smiles wiped flat off their faces, replaced by absolute shock. The blaring alarm swallowed the stunned silence for a few seconds until Nolan lunged for the keypad on the wall and punched in the disarm code. The siren cut off, leaving a ringing quiet, broken only by broken glass crunching under my boots and the ragged, shallow breathing of my grandson pressed against my chest. Nolan spun around to face me, dabbing a streak of gravy from his chin. His eyes jumped from the shattered door to me, then down to Owen, bundled in my coat. He stepped forward, hands raised in a frantic defensive gesture. "Dad, what the hell are you doing?" he shouted, his voice cracking with manufactured outrage. "You broke my door. You can't just break into my house." I looked at him and felt the full crushing weight of his failure as a father. Why was my grandson locked outside in freezing weather? "Nolan," I asked. My voice did not rise. It was flat, lethal, and quiet. Amber stepped forward, crossing her arms. "He was throwing a massive tantrum," she snapped, rolling her eyes as though I were the unreasonable one in the room. "He refused to eat the sweet potato casserole, started screaming, and was completely ruining the holiday for my parents. We put him on the patio for a 5-minute timeout to teach him a lesson. 5 minutes. Owen had been like ice. His core temperature had plummeted. He had been out there for at least half an hour, completely forgotten, while they drank wine and celebrated their own vanity. Burton Amber's father scoffed from his seat. "See here, Clifton," he said, settling into an authoritative tone. "You don't just invade another man's property over a simple disciplinary matter. You need to pay for that window and leave." I tightened my hold on Owen. The boy buried his cold face against my shoulder, small hands gripping the fabric of my shirt. I looked at Burton, then at Amber, and finally locked eyes with my son. Nolan tried to square his shoulders, reaching for some semblance of authority in a room he had just desecrated. "Dad, put my son down," Nolan demanded, moving closer. "You are overreacting. You need to leave right now." I let the silence sit for exactly 3 seconds. I wanted him to feel the full, absolute certainty of what was coming. I shifted Owen's weight, looked Nolan dead in the eye, and delivered the 6 words that would end his life as he knew it. "The house is mine." "Get out!" The blood drained instantly from Nolan's face. His jaw went slack. Amber let out a confused scoff and looked to her husband for reassurance, but Nolan was paralyzed. He knew exactly what I meant. He knew the deed was sitting safely in my vault. I did not wait for his rebuttal. I turned my back on the lavish table, the spilled wine, and the shattered glass, and carried my grandson straight out through the front door. The icy wind hit my face, but I did not break stride. I walked down the driveway toward my truck. Nolan came sprinting out behind me, slipping on the frost, his voice climbing into high, panicked shrieks. "You cannot take him!" he screamed, arms flailing. That is kidnapping. Put him down, or I swear to God I'm calling the cops. I ignored him. I pulled the passenger door open, got Owen settled inside, and pushed the heater to its highest setting. Then I walked around, climbed behind the wheel, and looked up. Nolan was planted in the middle of the street in that expensive sweater cell phone, against his ear screaming to a 911 dispatcher that a man had taken his son at gunpoint. I put the truck in drive. The tires bit at the ice. I pulled out and did not look back, leaving my son to reckon with the fact that he had just gone to war with the only man holding the deed to everything he owned. The sleet was punishing as I cleared the gates of Westlake, Ohio. I had the heat on full vents blasting the cab, theoretically warming, but it made no difference. Owen sat bundled in my oversized winter coat in the seat beside me, the coat nearly swallowing him whole. The violent shaking had stopped. That was the thing that turned my stomach. In engineering, you learn quickly that a structure under load that has stopped vibrating isn't stable. It has passed the point of resistance. It is failing. The body operates on identical principles. Shivering is the alarm system. When it goes quiet in the cold, the core has already been compromised. My right hand stayed on the wheel, knuckles white against the leather. My left hand I pressed flat to Owen's chest. I needed that confirmation, the rise and fall of his ribs. What I felt was shallow and uneven, every exhale laced with a wet, rattling rasp that drove the blood hard through my skull. My mind shifted into pure calculation. Cleveland Mercy Medical Center, 4.2 miles from my position. At current speed factoring the ice and the near-zero visibility, I was looking at a 7-minute window. 7 minutes felt like a structural lifetime. What kept flashing behind my eyes was that dining room, warm and golden turkey on the table, crystal glasses catching the light, Nolan and Amber laughing with her wealthy parents while Owen crouched against a frozen brick wall on the other side of the glass. They had sent him out there over a dinner dispute, cast him off like a piece of equipment that was in the way. Then the red glow of an emergency sign bled through the gray sleet ahead of me, and I made my decision. I skipped the visitor lot entirely. I drove straight up the ambulance ramp, jammed the transmission into park, and left the engine idling. I was out of the cab and around to Owen's door before the truck had fully settled. I lifted him into my arms shockingly, light his limbs without tension, shouldered through the automatic doors before they could fully slide apart, and crossed into the hard fluorescent brightness of the Cleveland Mercy Medical Center emergency room lobby. "I need a trauma team right now," I said loud and clear, not a plea, a directive. The triage nurse needed one look. Owen's lips were blue. His skin had gone waxy and pale. She drove her palm into a red button under the desk, and the double ward doors blew open. 3 nurses and a physician came through fast with a gurney. I placed Owen down. The moment they pulled my coat away and saw what he had on, thin cotton t-shirt, summer shorts, the evidence of what my son had done became irrefutable. No argument, no interpretation required. "Severe hypothermic exposure," the lead physician called out, stethoscope working across Owen's chest. "Core temperature still dropping. I want heated intravenous fluids and warming blankets now." I stepped back and watched them move with controlled, practiced urgency. Then they wheeled him down the corridor, and the trauma doors swung shut behind them. I walked to the threshold and stopped. My boots had dragged in ice melt and mud, leaving dark prints across the clean linoleum. I stood at those closed doors and felt the adrenaline bleed out of me, not leaving emptiness, but something colder and more durable. 10 minutes passed. The lead physician came back through mask, down, tablet in hand. His expression was measured but tight. He told me his name was Dr. Colwell. He glanced at his data, then looked up at me. "Are you the grandfather?" "Yes," I said. My voice was steady. "Clifton Harwick." Dr. Colwell gave a short nod and returned his attention to the screen. "We're working on his core temperature with internal warming protocols, but his respiratory picture is what concerns me most. There's a massive bronchial constriction. The cold exposure is part of it, but this runs much deeper than weather exposure alone." "Does this boy carry a diagnosis of chronic respiratory disease?" "Yes," I said. "Severe asthma from birth. He's on a daily nebulizer regimen and prescription steroid inhalers. The management is non-negotiable. It has to be consistent and exact." Dr. Colwell's frown sharpened. He scrolled the tablet, and when he spoke again, his tone was careful. "The blood panel we ran contradicts that history. There is no trace of maintenance corticosteroids in his system, not a residual marker. If this child has been on a prescribed daily protocol, He has not received a single dose in weeks, possibly longer. The inflammation in his airways is consistent with prolonged systemic neglect. How long since his last documented treatment? Those words settled over me like a load-bearing wall coming down. Something enormous clicked into position. I reached into my jacket, took out my phone, and pulled up the banking application. I went directly to the restricted medical trust, the account I had opened the day Owen was born, specifically constructed so that even if Nolan and Amber burned their finances to the ground, my grandson's medications would always be funded. I held the screen out so Dr. Colwell could read it clearly. At 6 o'clock this morning, I got an automated fraud notification. $15,000 had been wired out of this trust. The authorization note filed by my son stated the purpose as emergency winter respiratory therapy for Owen. Dr. Colwell studied the screen. For just a beat, the clinical composure slipped. His gaze tracked from the withdrawal figure back to my face. "Mr. Harwick," he said quietly, his voice now carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. "I can tell you with full medical certainty that not a dollar of that money reached this child's lungs. He has been fighting without medication for months. Whoever withdrew those funds did not spend them on his care." I put the phone away. I didn't need to raise my voice. The schematic of my son's deception was laid out in front of me with complete clarity. Nolan had broken into a restricted trust on a national holiday, fabricated a medical emergency as cover, and simultaneously left the child he claimed to be treating locked outside in freezing sleet. He had taken the money. He had let Owen suffer, and he had miscalculated his father entirely. "I need full documentation," I told Dr. Colwell. "Every degree of frostbite, every absent medication marker in his blood. A complete toxicological and physical report signed, printed, ready for court." Dr. Colwell nodded without hesitation. "As a mandated reporter, I'm obligated to record this level of neglect regardless. The file will be complete." He pushed back through the swinging doors. I walked to the row of plastic chairs along the far wall and sat down. The Cleveland Mercy Medical Center lobby was quiet around me, the particular silence of a hospital on a holiday. I unzipped my jacket and felt the cold damp of melted sleet soaking through my shirt underneath. I shut my eyes and began mapping the sequence. Finances locked down. First, Nolan had to be severed from every account and asset I held before I could move to the next phase. I was 3 steps into the sequence when the lobby doors hissed apart behind me and a wall of cold air came through, riding the sharp static crackle of a police radio. My eyes came open. 2 officers entered, large men in heavy winter uniforms, snow dusting their shoulders. They didn't approach the desk. They positioned themselves just inside the entrance and swept the waiting area with the deliberate, unhurried focus of men who already knew what they were looking for. They located me quickly enough. I was the only one sitting alone in the trauma wing, muddy boots, damp clothes, not a trace of panic on my face. A silent look passed between the 2 officers, one quick confirming beat, and then they were moving. Their boots struck the linoleum in that slow, weighted rhythm that signals authority before a word is spoken. Both men's hands dropped together to their utility belts as they advanced, fingers settling just shy of their holsters. Deliberate. Choreographed. The kind of posture designed to make a man feel the walls closing before they actually do. Clifton Harwick, the lead officer, broke the silence first. His words hit the bare lobby walls and bounced back hard, the flat, amplified ring of a voice accustomed to compliance. I kept my seat. My hands stayed where they were. My spine didn't retreat into the plastic chair behind me. I met his eyes with the same unhurried, calibrated look I give a load-bearing joint I suspect is about to fail. "Yes, I am Clifton Harwick. Step away from the pediatric ward and get to your feet slowly." His jaw might as well have been poured from concrete. "We received an emergency 911 dispatch from a Nolan Harwick. He reported a violent home invasion and the forced removal of a 7-year-old child from the property. You are the primary suspect in a kidnapping. Follow my instructions exactly, or you will be taken down by force." Something thickened in the air. My son's trap was fully engaged now, the whole mechanism depending on blind panic, on a false report landing hard enough to knock me off my feet before I could dismantle it. But Nolan had miscalculated. Catastrophically. He'd built his plan around the assumption that I would flinch, that the shock of uniformed men closing in would push me into exactly the wild, erratic behavior he'd scripted for me. What he never accounted for was that I have spent a career designing structures meant to absorb catastrophic force without buckling. Pressure isn't my enemy, it's my instrument. I set both palms flat against my knees, pulled in a slow breath, and started organizing the counter-argument in my head, every fabricated piece of his story lined up to be disassembled. The younger officer continued edging forward, shrinking the space between us. His gun hand hadn't left the leather of his duty belt. The older one angled wide to my right, cutting off the path to the sliding emergency doors. A containment formation straight out of the manual meant to eliminate options and manufacture surrender. I gave them nothing, my back found the cold-painted cinder block behind me, and I let it take my weight. There's a principle in structural engineering that most people learn the hard way when a massive load comes down on a column. The column that shifts is the one that fails. The one that holds gets to distribute the force on its own terms. 69 years old, boots caked with sleet and half-frozen mud. None of it moved me. I stood with the kind of stillness that only belongs to someone who has already calculated exactly what they can withstand. "Mr. Harwick," the older officer said, his voice riding over the vending machine, hum, and the faint electronic chirp of distant heart monitors. "We have a dispatch from your son Nolan. His account is that you broke through his glass patio door, got physical inside the home, and took his 7-year-old by force. He is pressing kidnapping charges and wants an immediate Amber Alert issued. Hands visible, step back from that corridor to the pediatric ward." My eyes went to the older officer's name tag. Officer Kettner. I raised both hands deliberately, slow palms turned fully outward. Not submission, disclosure. "Officer Kettner," I said, draining every edge of urgency from my voice before I let a word out. "I'm going to reach very slowly into my front left coat pocket. I am not reaching for a weapon. I am reaching for my cell phone. It holds the exact reason I entered that house the way I did, and the exact reason I brought my grandson straight to a trauma center instead of driving away." The younger officer's jaw went rigid. Kettner studied me for a beat, then gave one short, decisive nod. "Do it slowly," he said. I worked my hand into the damp lining of my coat pocket and drew the phone out. My thumb found the lock screen. The banking app was already up, the urgent alert that had pulled me from my kitchen that morning, still sitting on top. I rotated the screen so both men could read it, the stark red and white text throwing a wash of light between us. "Look at the top line," I said, letting my voice go low and flat. "That is a restricted medical trust fund. I opened it the day Owen was born, specifically because he has severe chronic asthma. That money is legally ring-fenced, it cannot be touched for anything else. It exists for his inhaler refills, his respiratory treatments, and emergency intervention. Only that. Now, read the timestamp. At 6:00 that morning, Nolan had initiated a wire transfer, $15,000 pulled from that account in a single transaction. The note attached to the withdrawal read, "Emergency Winter Respiratory Therapy Program." Kettner's eyes narrowed at the screen, some of the hard geometry leaving his stance. "A money dispute doesn't give you the right to bust through someone's door and walk off with their kid." His tone hadn't softened much. "You had options, a phone call, a family court filing." I scrolled to the photo gallery with my thumb. A phone call wasn't going to save anyone's life. I answered that call myself, I said. Every time I rang Nolan's number, it went to voicemail. I drove 4 hours into that sleet to see for myself what his emergency actually was. The $15,000 wasn't what broke that door. This is what broke that door. I brought the screen up close to Kettner's face. The photograph filled it edge to edge, taken from the snow outside, moments before I went through the glass. Owen was on the concrete patio in a thin cotton t-shirt and summer shorts, arms wrapped around himself. Behind him, perfectly visible through the glass, Nolan and his in-laws were gathered around a fully dressed holiday table, roasted turkey at the center, faces lit with laughter and warm light. It wasn't merely cruel. It was a different category of thing altogether. The younger officer leaned in. Something happened in the room. Then the tactical sharpness both men had been carrying drained out all at once, replaced by something colder and more still. What they were seeing was a child's skin gone, bluish, shaking violently in the frost, while his father sat less than 10 feet away with a glass of wine. "That timestamp puts this photo 45 minutes ago," I told him, touching the corner of the image. 8 degrees outside, long enough out there for his core temperature to drop into hypothermia range. You want to know why they put him out there? He wouldn't eat the sweet potato casserole. They called it a timeout. Holiday dinner uninterrupted. So, yes, Officer Kettner, I threw a heavy ceramic planter through their door. I pulled the boy out. My coat went around him, and I drove directly to this emergency room. If that sequence of events fits your kidnapping statute, clip the cuffs on right now. But before you do, I'd ask you to work through one question. Why would a kidnapper bypass every exit out of state and hand his victim straight to a pediatric trauma team? Kettner held the screen in his gaze for a long, unblinking moment. The set of his frame loosened. He looked at his partner, and something passed silently between them. No words necessary, the verdict already written in both their faces. Everything in the room had just realigned. The weight of this situation had swung entirely off me and come to rest squarely on the man who dialed 911. Kettner hadn't yet found his next sentence when the heavy trauma ward doors crashed open at the far end of the hall, both panels slamming hard against their magnetic stops. Dr. Colwell came through at a pace that left no room for pleasantries. White coat crease stethoscope sitting crooked at his collar face, carrying the specific fury of a clinician who has just seen something that should never have been allowed to happen. A sheaf of freshly printed lab results was in his hand. He pulled up short the moment he registered the two officers on either side of me. He wasn't shaken by the sight. He looked like a man who just walked into the room he'd been trying to reach. "Are you the officers responding to the incident at the Harwick residence?" Dr. Colwell said it like a demand, his voice holding the full weight of someone used to being the last word in any room. "Yes," Kettner said, his attention pulling away from me. "We are investigating a reported abduction." "There is no abduction," Dr. Colwell said, sharp and flat, the printed pages cutting the air as he gestured with them. "What you have is a severe case of medical and physical neglect. I've gotten the boy's core temperature back to a survivable level, but that is nowhere near the top of what I'm looking at. Mr. Harwick told me the child has a documented history of serious asthma, requiring daily medication to manage." I gave the doctor a single nod, eyes steady on him. Nolan's stated reason for pulling that $15,000 that same morning had been advanced respiratory therapy. Dr. Colwell pivoted toward the officers, and the fury behind his eyes was the cold, precise kind, not hot, not scattered. We ran a full comprehensive blood panel on the boy when he came in. Getting his baseline right was the only way to counter both the hypothermia and the bronchial spasms correctly. "Gentlemen, that child's bloodstream contains absolutely zero trace of any daily corticosteroid. Not a residual trace. Nothing. A boy with his level of chronic asthma should be carrying steady cumulative levels of maintenance medication in his system at all times. The total absence of those compounds tells me he hasn't been given a single dose of his prescribed medication in weeks, possibly months." The younger officer cracked open a notepad, his pen clicking with a sharp snap. "Are you telling us the parents have been withholding medical care?" "What I'm telling you," Dr. Colwell said, voice flat as poured concrete, "is that his lungs are severely inflamed from chronic unmanaged deterioration. The cold exposure today triggered a massive respiratory event on top of airways that were already compromised by long-term neglect. Whoever held the legal obligation to fill his prescriptions and administer his daily doses abandoned that duty entirely. Had Mr. Harwick not gotten the boy into this building today, the combination of unmedicated lungs and freezing temperatures would have driven him into fatal respiratory arrest before dark." I stood without moving, letting every word land on the two officers, the way a structural report lands on an inspector, fact by irrefutable fact. Nolan hadn't simply left his son standing in the cold. He had been methodically cutting off the child's life-sustaining medication for months, while simultaneously draining a restricted medical trust, claiming the money was flowing toward advanced treatments. $15,000 had vanished, and not 1 cent of it had ever reached Owen's airways. Kettner slowly reached up and keyed the radio mic clipped to his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. Suspect is on location at the hospital. Suspect is fully cooperative. Cancel the Amber Alert. We are redirecting the investigation. I need a secondary unit dispatched to the Harwick residence immediately. Secure the parents. Do not allow them to leave the property. We are opening a criminal investigation for severe child endangerment and medical neglect." The radio crackled back with confirmation. Kettner released the mic and turned to face me. The arresting stare had left his eyes entirely. What had replaced it was something grimmer, the measured acknowledgement of a man who had just recalibrated who he was actually looking at. He was standing next to the only person in this situation who had done the right thing. Mr. Harwick Kettner said, voice low, and waited with seriousness. I'm going to need you to email me that photograph and the banking notification right now. Your son called us counting on having you in handcuffs before you could get a single word out. He is about to discover that dialing 911 was the worst decision he ever made. I didn't smile. There was nothing to celebrate, only the cold, necessary machinery of justice turning over. I unlocked my phone and began assembling the evidence transfer that would strip Nolan's carefully constructed deception down to bare framing. The foundation of his lies had cracked under the load of the truth, and I intended to bring the whole structure down on his head. But before I could send the automatic emergency room doors slid open again, and Nolan's voice panicked and performing knifed through the lobby. The fight had come to me. The doors split apart with a sharp mechanical hiss, pulling in a blast of frozen air, and the chaotic entry of my son and his assembled family. Nolan came through first face, flushed deep red, half from the cold, half from the rage he was staging for anyone who happened to be watching. Amber followed a step behind, both hands pressed to her face, squeezing out the kind of theatrical sobs that echo off sterile walls on purpose. Moving alongside them, like hired muscle, was Burton Amber's father. He still had on the tailored cashmere cardigan he'd been wearing at the Thanksgiving table. His carriage was rigid with the particular arrogance of a man who has spent decades believing wealth is a universal solvent for inconvenient facts. The three of them looked completely ridiculous, dressed for a catalog shoot, storming a public trauma center like a hotel manager had gotten their order wrong. I stayed in my corner chair watching them, with the quiet measuring attention of an engineer observing a flawed structure in the final seconds before it fails under its own weight. I didn't get up. I didn't offer a word to my son or his weeping wife. I slipped my phone from my pocket, silenced the volume, activated the audio recorder, and tucked the device beneath the folded hem of my damp coat. Nolan spotted Officer Kettner near the triage desk and locked onto him, finger already leveling across the room in my direction. "That is the man," Nolan announced, projecting his voice to reach every nurse and patient in earshot. "That is my father. He broke into my home, destroyed my property, and kidnapped my child. I want him placed under arrest right now. I want my son returned to me immediately." Officer Kettner didn't flinch. He made no move toward his handcuffs. He fixed Nolan with a look so heavy, so stripped of sympathy, that my son actually retreated half a step. Kettner crossed his arms deliberately across his chest. "Mr. Harwick," the officer said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "I'd suggest you bring your volume down and step back from the desk. You are standing in a pediatric trauma center, not a courtroom." Amber pushed past her husband's face, arranged into theatrical indignation. "How dare you speak to him like that?" she snapped, driving her designer bag down against the reception counter. "Our son was removed from our home. We demand to see Owen this instant. Get me whoever is in charge of this ward. We are taking our boy home, and we are pursuing every available charge against that man in the corner." Burton stepped forward, then laying a thick manicured hand on Nolan's shoulder and steering his son-in-law aside so he could run the negotiation himself. Burton was a commercial real estate developer, a man forged in the business of pressuring city planners and lubricating zoning inspectors with well-placed envelopes. He moved to the charge nurse behind the reception glass, produced a slim, leather-bound checkbook from his breast pocket, and leaned in close. "Listen to me very carefully," Burton said, his voice falling to a greasy conspiratorial murmur. "I understand how these things spiral out of control. My son-in-law's father is elderly. He gets confused. He overreacted to a routine disciplinary timeout. This is an embarrassment all around, and we'd all prefer to resolve it before it becomes a legal problem for this hospital." The charge nurse stopped typing. She looked up at Burton, her face giving nothing away. "Excuse me, sir," she said, voice flat and unhurried. Burton offered a practiced, polished smile. "I'm prepared to be very generous in exchange for your discretion," he murmured, thumb sliding a platinum credit card partway from his wallet. "I can authorize a very substantial anonymous contribution to the pediatric ward right now. 50,000, perhaps more. All that's needed is that you set aside the unnecessary paperwork, release my grandson to my daughter, and allow the admission records to go missing. You go home better off. The hospital gains a new wing. Everyone walks away clean." I sat without moving in my chair, my phone gathering every syllable. Burton had just attempted to bribe a licensed medical professional inside a crowded emergency room to bury evidence of severe child neglect. He had handed me precisely the instrument I needed to dismantle him. You cannot bribe gravity. You cannot pay a bridge that's failing to stop its own collapse, and you absolutely cannot purchase your way out of a federal child endangerment investigation. Before the charge nurse could draw breath to respond, the heavy trauma ward doors swung outward into the lobby. Dr. Colwell came through at full stride. He wasn't alone this time. Directly alongside him walked a sharp, composed woman carrying a thick clipboard, a laminated state identification badge hanging from a lanyard at her collar. Dr. Colwell stopped in front of the reception desk, eyes sweeping across Burton, then Amber, then settling hard on Nolan. "Are you the biological parents of the 7-year-old boy currently fighting for breath in my trauma unit?" The demand carried the full, undeniable authority of a physician who expects to be answered. Nolan stiffened, rolling his shoulders back in a show of posture. "Yes, I'm his father, and I'm demanding you discharge him into my custody right now. My father is mentally unstable and removed him without our consent." The woman with the clipboard moved forward, cutting Nolan off before he could construct another lie. "My name is Agent Tully," she said, her voice entirely free of emotion. "I am a senior investigator with the Department of Child Protective Services. Your son is not being discharged to you, Mr. Harwick, effective immediately. You and your wife are legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of his hospital room." Amber's hands snapped up to cover her mouth. "You cannot do that," she shrieked, spinning toward her father. "Tell them they cannot do that." Agent Tully reached into her clipboard and produced a freshly printed page stamped with an official state seal. "This matter has already been addressed, ma'am. The presiding judge issued a direct emergency mandate 3 minutes ago. Dr. Colwell has surrendered the child's full toxicology report and physical assessment. Your son's body is in severe hypothermic crisis. Beyond that, his blood work makes clear he has been deprived of his prescribed life-saving respiratory medication for a considerable stretch of time." The color evacuated Nolan's face in an instant, the way pressure bleeds out of a ruptured line. A greasy film of sweat rose across his forehead. That can't be right." He stumbled over the words, eyes raking the room in the desperate circuit of a trapped animal. "Those prescriptions come through every single month without fail. This very morning, we moved $15,000 out of his medical trust to fund a specialized winter therapy program. My father can verify the trust, just ask him." That was my signal. I pushed to my feet, covered the linoleum in deliberate strides, and planted myself squarely in front of my son. I fished the phone from my jacket, stopped the audio recording, and let the silence hold between us. "Yes," I said. No temperature in my voice, just cold-level bedrock. "I'm well aware the trust exists. What I'm also aware of is that you emptied it at 6 in the morning while that child was struggling to pull in a breath. Dr. Colwell has put on the record that Owen's lungs have gone months without a single dose of his medication. So, there is one question every person in this room with a badge is going to want," answered Nolan. "Where exactly did $15,000 land?" Burton wedged himself between us, then jaw-clamped face burning with the specific fury of someone who has never in his life been backed into a corner. "Listen to me carefully, old man," he said, thrusting a blunt finger at my chest. "You will walk back every syllable of this right now, or I will drown you in court filings until you have no pension, no property, and nothing standing to your name." I held my ground without so much as a shift of weight. I raised the audio file on the screen and tilted the phone until Burton could read it for himself. "I'm not here to accuse anyone," I said, my voice staying flat and unhurried. "What I'm going to do is hand this recording directly to Officer Kettner. The recording where you propositioned a registered nurse with $50,000 to alter medical records and shut down the police inquiry." That finger stopped dead in the air. His mouth moved, nothing followed. The full, breathless reality of his position arrived all at once. Burton had spent his whole life engineering leverage over people who lacked the resources to push back. He had never once found himself outmaneuvered in a way that turned his own fortune into the sharpest weapon pointed at him. Agent Tully pivoted toward Officer Kettner. "Officer, remove these individuals from hospital grounds immediately. Any attempt to approach the trauma ward, and you have full authority to detain them for obstruction of an active child protective investigation." Amber lunged forward, her voice splitting into something raw and unraveling. "You have no legal right to separate me from my child. I carried him. I'm his mother. You cannot hand him over to some old man." Agent Tully leveled a look at Amber that needed no amplification. The instant you locked an asthmatic child outside on a frozen patio. While you stayed warm with your wine, you forfeited every ounce of that claim. Her voice was even stripped of all decoration. Emergency custody of the minor transfers to the state as of now. He will be placed temporarily in the care of his grandfather, Mr. Clifton Harwick, the sole person in that house who moved to keep him breathing. Nolan's gaze crossed the room and found mine. What lived in his eyes wasn't rage. It was the hollowed-out cord look of someone feeling the floor vanish under their feet. The bold, dismissive son who'd been cataloging me as a senile inconvenience not an hour earlier had ceased to exist. The thing that replaced him was smaller. Cracked. "Dad, please!" The words came out broke in his voice, giving way as Officer Kettner closed a hand around his elbow. "Don't let this go where it's going. We lose everything. Tell them it was a misunderstanding, one word from you, and this is over." I gave him a long, quiet look. The boy I had raised out of nothing, the man who had plunged his hand into his own son's medical account, stood in front of me and lied without blinking, and then worked to have me removed so he could run without interference. A structural engineer grasps something that most people never sit still long enough to understand. A foundation that has rotted through cannot be saved. Corrupted rebar doesn't take a patch. A structure whose integrity is gone at the core doesn't get resurfaced, it gets leveled. You clear the wreckage and you start from raw ground. "I have nothing left to say to you," I told him. Then I turned and covered the distance to the trauma ward's double doors. The lobby detonated behind me, then fell away as officers pushed them out into the storm. The mechanism had fired precisely as it was built to, but I carried no illusions. That was the first move on the board, not the closing one. Nolan and Burton would mobilize quickly. High-fee attorneys' motions stacked like sandbags, a choreographed campaign to commandeer the narrative. They'd probe my finances and try to exhaust me into folding. What they hadn't reckoned with was the shadow audit I had been assembling in the background the entire time. The $15,000 they had skimmed was to them a tidy extraction. They had no idea it was a single exposed thread in a fabric of fraud far wider than that. They were convinced this morning was rock bottom. I was going to teach them how many floors existed beneath it. Back in my study in Columbus, Ohio, the quiet was so absolute it pressed against you. That particular dense, loaded stillness, the kind a building holds in the seconds before its load-bearing columns begin to buckle. My grandson was asleep upstairs in the guest room, buried under 4 layers of thermal blankets, a warm mist humidifier humming steadily on the nightstand beside him. His breathing remained terribly shallow, threaded through with a faint rattling wheeze that settled like a weight behind my sternum. But his core temperature was edging back towards safe. The hospital had released him into my emergency custody under binding court orders, with State Child Protective Services maintaining tight watch over the arrangement. I lowered myself into the chair behind my heavy walnut desk and let the sound of sleet against the glass fill the room. The storm outside was furious. What was running inside my head was colder than any weather and far more deliberate. An engineer doesn't fracture when the structure begins to sway. He locates the stress points, isolates the failures, and designs the controlled demolition. Nolan and Amber were a compromised structure that rested on exactly 2 things: my capital and a parental trust I had extended well beyond any reasonable limit. I was about to remove both at once. I drew my phone from my pocket and called a number that had sat dormant for nearly 3 years. 2 rings no more, and then a precise, unhurried voice came on the line. Sterling Quaid had eliminated pleasantries from his professional life as a matter of settled principle. Forensic accountant by training, ruthless corporate litigator by reputation, a man whose record of dismantling financial crimes with surgical precision had a well-documented effect on opposing counsel's composure. But none of that is how I knew him. To me, he had always been the razor-edge, combustible young man I had pulled off one of my commercial construction sites 30 years back. He had been moving concrete through punishing summer heat, scraping together rent for a mother who fed her earnings straight to a bottle. The thing that stopped me was how his mind operated working load distribution figures in his head at a pace that outran my most experienced foreman without breaking a sweat. I paid his law school tuition outright, a single anonymous cashier's check, with no conditions attached. The one thing I asked was that he take that mind and forge it into something unbreakable. He had delivered on that without reservation, building a legal practice that other people's lawyers actively feared. And the loyalty he held toward me was the one entry in his ledger he tracked with more care than any dollar figure. "Clifton?" Sterling said, his voice dropping into the low, locked-in register he kept for things that mattered. "A call to my direct line on a national holiday means only one thing." "The sky is falling, Sterling. It came apart this morning." Every word I spoke was measured, calibrated, the spoken equivalent of a spirit level held perfectly flat. "Here is what I need from you. A total financial lockdown starting right now. Every trust account, every jointly held asset, every credit line bearing my signature, all of it sealed off immediately. Cut off their air." From the far end of the line, the sharp rapid fire of a mechanical keyboard started up. Sterling was already in motion. No request to be walked through the emotional context. No perfunctory words of comfort. No ask for background details he hadn't yet required. He took the directive and moved on it with the brand of efficiency that had been rattling courtrooms for years. "Done," he said, the keys snapping like rounds going off downrange. Full hard freeze across the entire asset portfolio. It's live now. Banking institutions lock within 60 seconds. 0 withdrawals, 0 wire transfers, no liquidations of any kind. "Clifton, I'm inside the administrative panel for the restricted medical trust you established for your grandson." His tone shifted, sharpening into something with a dangerous edge. "There's a wire transfer logged at 6 this morning, $15,000 outflagged under an emergency medical authorization. Nolan initiated that." "I know," I said. Outside white frost was creeping up the corners of the window panes. His stated reason was that Owen needed immediate winter respiratory therapy. I let a bead of silence open up. Sterling, he needed to hear this straight. I walked into that house and found my grandson out on a concrete patio in freezing weather, wearing nothing but a t-shirt. His airway was collapsing. The trauma physician's records show he hasn't received a single dose of his prescribed asthma medication in months. The keyboard went quiet mid-stroke. What followed wasn't ordinary silence. It had a density to it, almost a physical presence. When Sterling came back on the line, the precise professional remove he wore, like armor, had dissolved. What replaced it was something colder and far more personal. "He's your blood, Clifton," Sterling said, his voice dropping low. "But I am going to deeply enjoy taking him apart. Let me run that wire transfer down right now. 2 minutes, I'll push past the holiday holds and pull the routing data from the receiving institution." I sat in the darkened study, following the steady rhythm of the old brass carriage clock on the fireplace shelf. Every tick represented another second my grandson had spent locked in that frozen air. Every tick was another seamless, deliberate lie my son had delivered while holding my gaze. For 35 years, I had funneled everything I had into Nolan. I paid his university tuition outright, sent him off that stage without a weight of debt chasing him. I put him in his first dependable vehicle so he could drive himself to job interviews without breaking down on the side of a highway. When he needed a down payment on that sprawling colonial, I quietly wrote the check he'd talked me into. It was the kind of neighborhood where a child could grow up with room to breathe. I had carved into my own savings to guarantee my family's security. What I got in return was the part of the oblivious walking checkbook, an old man whose sole function was to keep bankrolling his son's hollow, insatiable appetites. The disrespect had never been hidden well. It showed in the curl of his smirk and the short, obligatory phone calls. But what he had done now crossed a line that no passage of time could walk anyone back from. The phone crackled. Sterling exhaled a low, barely restrained sound of disgust. "Clifton," he said, his voice pulled tight with something approaching disbelief. "I've traced the routing number. That $15,000 didn't reach any medical clinic, no pharmacy, no pediatric respiratory specialist." "Then where did it go, Sterling?" I said, my hand closing around the thick walnut edge of the desk. "It went straight into a commercial real estate holding company in the upscale downtown district." The revulsion in his voice was barely held behind professional delivery. "Direct wire deposit, commercial lease agreement. I'm into the corporate registry now. The lease sits under a newly formed LLC. The sole registered proprietor is Amber Harwick. Clifton, they used your grandson's asthma medication fund to secure the deposit on an upscale retail storefront in Westlake's Crocker Park district. They are opening a luxury fashion boutique." The words struck the center of my chest, the way a wrecking ball finds a load-bearing wall. A luxury fashion boutique. I closed my eyes. The Thanksgiving table came back to me. The expensive crystal, the wine, catching the candlelight. the permanent sneer on Burton's face. Amber's theatrical collapse in the hospital lobby. They had let a 7-year-old boy struggle to breathe quietly, withholding his medication month after month, so they could accumulate enough stolen money to sell designer clothing and handbags. They had locked a sick child outside in freezing cold to stop him from disrupting their celebration, a celebration of a vanity enterprise built entirely on funds his own lungs depended on to function. My anger stopped burning. It cooled, compressed, and set into something that couldn't be cracked. "Don't flag the wire fraud to the bank. Not yet," I said, opening my eyes to the dark room. "Leave those funds right where they are. If we pull the money back now, they'll frame it as a banking error and try to walk away clean. I need them to put their names on the final lease. I want them legally anchored to that liability. No exit." Sterling absorbed the tactical reasoning without a pause. "You want them to tie the noose with their own fraudulent rope?" He said, a thread of dark satisfaction running through it. "Precisely," I answered. "We're going to surface every financial transgression they've buried. Go all the way down, Sterling find every crack in the foundation." The reality of that boutique deposit settled into the quiet of my study like sediment sinking through undisturbed water. Sterling's breathing came through the receiver with audible weight, the sound of fury held barely in check. But I wasn't burning. No blinding heat, no urge to upend anything. My mind had moved into a state of cold, refrigerated clarity. An engineer reads a surface crack differently than most people do. When the foundation shifts the split, you can see accounts for only a fraction of the structural failure hidden behind the walls. Nolan had stolen $15,000 from a medical trust. That was a sloppy, cornered move. Cornered men don't bleed from a single wound. The rot ran deeper than one unauthorized transfer. I moved across the study to the tall windows. The sleet had given way to heavy driving snow, laying a thick white sheet across the front lawn. I watched the oak tree's ice-laden branches bow under the weight. "Sterling," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the room's quiet. "Keep going. A man who drains his sick child's medication fund to bankroll a retail storefront does not stop at $15,000. Pull the municipal property records on the colonial house." A brief pause. "Clifton, I drafted that deed myself," Sterling replied, his voice shifting into rapid calculating efficiency. "We anchored the title entirely in your name to wall it off from your son's liabilities. He holds no legal authority to borrow against it or move the equity." "I know exactly how we structured it," I told him. "But Nolan has been living inside those walls for 4 years, conducting himself like a man who owns the place outright. Arrogance curdles into stupidity fast. Check the municipal registry. I need to know the precise load-bearing status of that property." I tracked the hard, rapid percussion of the keyboard as Sterling worked into the secure county databases. The ticking of the carriage clock seemed to fall into rhythm with his keystrokes. 2 full minutes passed without a word from either of us. The silence stretched and went taut, and then I heard it, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath on the other end. The typing stopped dead. "Clifton," Sterling whispered. Every trace of his customary unshakable composure had been stripped away. His voice was hollow, ringing with a deep, sickening disbelief. "What did you find?" I asked, keeping every part of myself still. "There's a lien on the property." The words came out one at a time, like stones dropped into standing water. "A massive encumbrance, a second mortgage executed exactly 90 days ago. The bank dispersed a lump sum of $250,000 against the equity of the house." The numbers settled into the silence of my study and held there. $250,000. I kept my eyes fixed on the driving snow outside and processed it the way I process a load calculation without flinching. "That is a mathematical impossibility," I said, flat and certain. "The deed is locked in my vault. I am the sole guarantor on that property. No underwriter in this state would close a second mortgage without my physical presence, my government identification, and my signature on paper." Sterling's fingers were already moving, breaching the lending institution's digital archive. "I'm pulling the digitized loan packet right now," he muttered, his tone narrowing into a lethal predatory focus. He moved through those banking portals the way he always moved, like a man who had dismantled 100 frauds and never once lost his footing. "I have the authorization, Vector Clifton." His voice went flat with contempt. "They bypassed the physical requirements entirely. The loan was executed digitally through a third-party broker." "How?" I demanded. "Power of attorney." Sterling answered the phrase weighted with barely restrained revulsion. A comprehensive, durable financial power of attorney, a legal instrument granting Nolan Harwick complete unfettered authority to encumber, liquidate, or transfer any real estate asset bearing your name. I'm sending that document to your secure email now. My monitor chimed. I stepped away from the window, lowered myself into my leather chair, and opened the encrypted file. The screen threw pale light across the dark grain of my desk. I read the scanned document, dense legal language page after page, establishing Nolan as my sole financial proxy, the stated justification being my advancing age and an alleged decline in physical health. But I didn't linger on the deceptive body of the text. What I was about to discover wasn't just a betrayal. It was something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine the full depth of what someone close to me had been quietly building against me. Before that comes to light, I want to ask you something. If you suspected someone you loved was working against you in secret, would you confront them directly, or would you stay quiet and build your case first? I went directly to the final page, and there at the bottom of that glowing white screen was my signature. I leaned in, studying it closely. The craftsmanship was remarkable. The loops, the precise angle of each letter, the deliberate weight on every downstroke, an exact duplicate, flawless in every particular. Next to the forged signature sat the blue ink stamp of a licensed public notary. I shifted my attention to the date printed in the upper right corner. Late August. The timeline hit me with the force of a load-bearing beam giving way. The memory came back immediately, sharp, specific, unbidden. Late August. Nolan had appeared at my home in Columbus, Ohio, wearing the face of a humble, desperate son. He said the roof of the Colonial had taken serious water damage in a summer storm. He needed a personal loan of $50,000 to get the shingles replaced before the cold came. I drove out to the property the very next morning. I went up a 20-foot aluminum ladder to assess the situation myself. What I was about to uncover that night was not a simple betrayal. It was a deliberate, calculated campaign waged against me by someone I had given everything to. He hadn't simply absorbed the refusal I'd given him. He'd turned it into a weapon. While I was out on that roof in the August heat, working my way across the pitch to check the integrity of his home, Nolan had been inside mine. He'd asked to use my private study to take a business call. I had handed him access to my inner sanctum without a second thought. He used those 2 hours to go through my filing cabinets, pulling tax returns, canceled checks, original blueprints. He stole my signature. He sat at my own desk, tracing the curves of my handwriting, while I was balanced on a ladder, risking my neck trying to protect his family from a roof that required no protecting whatsoever. The full, suffocating weight of that treachery settled over me like something I couldn't shake loose. Nolan wasn't a careless father who had drifted into a handful of selfish financial mistakes. He was a predator. He had engineered a $250,000 extraction, and he had known precisely what it would cost me. He and Amber had funneled that loan into offshore accounts, feeding her retail venture and whatever mountain of luxury debt they had quietly constructed. But the money itself wasn't the true horror. The real horror was structural. Nolan had defaulted on the loan deliberately, not one payment made. I could hear the delinquency notices stacking up as Sterling read through the bank ledger over the phone. The design was to let the mortgage collapse entirely. He intended to allow the bank to foreclose, knowing the fraudulent debt would fall squarely onto my shoulders. He was going to drain my life savings, wreck my credit, and leave his own father bankrupt and without a roof over his head in the final years of his life. He wanted to destroy you, Sterling said, his voice cutting through the heavy quiet of my study. We need to deploy the nuclear option right now. I'm drafting an emergency injunction to send to the federal banking authorities. I'll contact the district attorney and have Nolan and Amber arrested for first-degree wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. I can have patrol cars outside their hotel by midnight. I sat with the forged signature glowing on my monitor. The blue notary stamp stared back at me, a symbol of how efficiently a lifetime of honest labor could be gutted by someone you had trusted without reservation. The fury inside me did not ignite into something loud. It moved in the opposite direction. It compressed, cooled, and hardened into a single cold structural column of tactical resolve. No, I said quietly, no tremor in my voice. Sterling stopped typing. The silence between us thickened. Clifton, this is federal fraud. If the bank doesn't receive notification immediately, you're personally carrying $250,000 in liability. They are trying to bury you alive. I know exactly what they're trying to do, Sterling, I replied, settling back in my chair. But an engineer doesn't detonate the charges while the target is still standing outside the blast radius. The moment we alert the bank, Nolan becomes the victim. He'll bring in aggressive defense attorneys. He'll claim I gave him verbal authorization to execute that document because my faculties were slipping. He will drag this through the court system for years, hiding behind the word misunderstanding. I will not hand him a legal defense. I will not surrender a single inch of room for him to maneuver. Then what are you instructing me to do? Sterling asked, the slow weight of recognition entering his voice. Leave the trap exactly the way they built it, I told him, eyes fixed on the snow hammering the glass outside. Don't alert the banking authorities. Don't touch the fraudulent mortgage account. Let Nolan and Amber go on believing their scheme is running without interference. Let them sit comfortable in the certainty that I have no idea $250,000 is sitting in their offshore holding company. Clifton, that is an extraordinarily dangerous tactical position, Sterling warned, though I could hear the thread of cold admiration woven through the caution. If you let that mortgage stand, you are holding a loaded weapon aimed directly at your own head. I am the one holding the weapon, Sterling, I told him, keeping my voice level. I am simply not squeezing the trigger until the barrel is flush against my son's chest. We are going to use this forged power of attorney as the central lever of their destruction. Nolan believes he has wrapped a heavy chain around my neck. What he has actually done is hand me the exact instrument I need to pull down everything he's built. Keep working through their accounts. Secure the original notary logbook entries. Build the complete forensic profile in absolute silence. We will bring the guillotine down in the courtroom, directly in front of the presiding judge. When Nolan makes his move to take my grandson from me, let him walk into the room, certain he has already won. We will make sure he walks out in handcuffs. The old brass carriage clock on the fireplace shelf of my study had just struck 2 in the afternoon when the heavy brass knocker on my front door rang through the quiet house. I was at my desk examining the freshly printed copy of The Forged Power of Attorney Sterling had sent through the secure channel. The faint, steady hum of the warm mist humidifier, drifting down from upstairs, told me Owen was still asleep, his exhausted body finally surrendering to rest after the ordeal on that frozen patio. I folded the document, slowly slid it into the front pocket of my flannel shirt, and made my way down the hallway to the foyer. I had no need to check the security cameras to know who had driven through the storm to reach me. Desperation runs on a predictable timetable, and arrogant men always believe they can produce a checkbook and make a crumbling situation stand back upright. I threw the deadbolt and pulled the heavy front door open. The cold poured in immediately, sharp and biting. Standing on my porch were Burton and Claudette. They looked profoundly out of place on the modest concrete steps of my home in Columbus, Ohio. Burton wore his tailored wool overcoat, and Claudette was wrapped in a dark fur-trimmed jacket. Behind them, idling in the driveway, sat a massive luxury SUV, its exhaust pushing thick white plumes into the frozen air. Burton didn't wait for an invitation. He offered no greeting. He used his size to step directly across my threshold, shouldering me back a half step into my own foyer. Claudette followed, her eyes moving over the simple, unpretentious interior, with an expression of undisguised aristocratic disdain. Burton pulled the front door shut behind him, sealing out the storm, and immediately moved to command the space. He was a commercial real estate developer, a man who had spent his career using broad shoulders and expensive suits to push contractors around and bully city officials into compliance. He positioned himself uncomfortably close, using his height to look down at me, crowding my personal space. But I had spent 40 years walking open steel beams hundreds of feet off the ground. A man in a wool overcoat throwing his weight around in my hallway didn't register as any sort of threat. I held my ground without flinching, letting his aggression press against something that simply didn't yield. "Listen to me very carefully," Burton began, his voice projecting with the manufactured force of practiced authority. "I have spent the last 4 hours untangling lawyers, hospital administrators, and government agents, all as a consequence of your theatrical little stunt. Today my daughter is at my house in complete hysterics because you manipulated the state into removing her child. You have crossed a serious legal line, and I am standing here to give you one opportunity to undo the damage before I come down on you in ways you are not remotely prepared for." I looked at him, keeping my breathing slow and even. "Ruin me," I repeated, flat and quiet. Burton reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a slim, leather-bound checkbook. He drew a silver pen from his inside pocket and clicked it open with a sharp, deliberate snap. He raised the checkbook and held the pen above the blank page. Nolan told me about the $15,000. Burton said, his tone thick with condescending impatience. He told me about the medical trust. It was a stupid, impulsive decision from a young man under pressure. But it is just money, Clifton. It is not a kidnapping. It is not child endangerment. This is a minor financial disagreement between a father and his son. He cleared his throat. Here's what's going to happen. I write you a check for the full $15,000 right now. Another $5,000 on top for your trouble. You deposit it this afternoon. You pick up the phone and call that Child Protective Services agent and tell her you blew this out of proportion. You tell her Owen was on that patio for 2 minutes, not 30. You drop the complaint and my grandson comes home to my daughter before nightfall. I kept my eyes on the silver pen suspended above that checkbook, the staggering uncut nerve of what this man was laying on the table pressed against the room, like something you could feel on your skin. Burton wasn't negotiating. He was attempting to buy his way clear of a criminal case. He was affixing a $20,000 figure to the blue, frost-bitten mouth of a 7-year-old child. In his mind, money was the universal solvent, something that could chemically dissolve the documented reality of his daughter, sealing a sick boy outside in the cold so her wine and candles evening could proceed without disruption. And if I decide I'm not in the business of returning my grandson to the people who put him in that hospital, I asked, my voice sinking to something flat and deliberate. The professional veneer peeled off Burton's face in one clean strip, his jaw locked. Something meaner and older took the businessman's place. Turn me down, Clifton, and I will unleash a legal assault on you that will knock the air right out of your chest, he said, closing the gap between us to almost nothing. I'll have the sharpest corporate litigators in Ohio on your doorstep by morning. Civil suits trespassing, emotional distress, destruction of property, every one of them filed simultaneously. Then we drag you into family court, and we tell the judge you're a confused, senile old man who snatched a child in a delusional episode. We freeze your pension. We pour your savings into legal defense costs. I will keep you buried in motions and hearings for the next 10 years until there is nothing left. No money, no standing, no independence. Take what's being offered, Clifton. Hand the boy back, pocket the check, and disappear from our lives before I make sure you have nothing left to disappear to. Claudette moved in beside him, arms cinched tight against her ribs. You are dismantling a family over what amounts to a misunderstanding, she said, voice sharp with condescension. Amber is a devoted mother who used poor judgment for a moment. What you're doing right now is the act of a vindictive, bitter old man. I didn't raise my voice. My hands stayed loose at my sides. I slid 2 fingers into the front pocket of my flannel shirt and stepped past everything they were throwing at me, the theatrics, the dollar signs, the manufactured outrage. I drew out the folded sheet of printer paper Sterling had forwarded, opened it without any rush, pressed the crease flat with my thumb, and held it out in Burton's direction. Your check doesn't interest me, Burton, I said, keeping every syllable level. What I'd like is for you to read this. Burton's frown deepened, his silver pen dangling from fingers that had forgotten what to do with it. He looked at the page, then back at me, his eyes going narrow and wary. What is this supposed to be? He made no move to take it. Take it and find out, I said, letting a strand of something cold and unbending into those words. He set the checkbook aside and snatched the paper from my hand without ceremony. Claudette pressed in over his shoulder, both of them scanning the text in silence. I watched Burton's eyes work their way through the dense legal phrasing. The man built commercial real estate deals for a living. Contract language was not foreign territory to him. I didn't explain a word of it. I just watched his gaze move steadily down the page past the authorization language toward that bottom right corner. I watched it arrive, the forged signature carrying my name, the blue ink seal of a licensed notary planted right beside it. I watched the precise moment the scaffolding holding up his confidence came apart underneath him. What you're holding, I said, my voice carrying into the foyer's silence like a load-bearing calculation delivered to a room full of engineers, is a durable financial power of attorney. Executed exactly 90 days ago, it grants your son-in-law unrestricted authority over every piece of real estate I own. 3 months back, Nolan showed up on my doorstep, performing the role of a son in crisis, telling me his roof had taken storm damage and he needed $50,000. I turned him down flat because that roof wasn't damaged. But while I was out on his property with a ladder checking shingles, he was inside my house working through my private records. That document is the result. Burton swallowed. The color retreated from his face in a slow, sickly drain, everything going the gray of old concrete. His breathing went shallow. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Do you understand what he put that forged signature to work on, Burton? I asked, nudging one step closer, just enough to make a large man ease back slightly. He ran a second mortgage through a third-party digital broker, using that fraudulent instrument to get around every standard banking safeguard. He pulled a lump sum of $250,000 out of the equity in a house that belongs entirely to me. Then he made not one single payment. His intention was to let the bank foreclose with the fraudulent debt falling legally on my shoulders. He was engineering my bankruptcy. Claudette's hand flew to her throat with a sharp, involuntary gasp. "Burton!" she said, in a voice that had lost every ounce of its polished edge. "Burton, what is he saying?" Burton said nothing. His stare was fixed on the paper, the way a man stares at a live wire he's just realized he's touching. He didn't need a translation. He'd been navigating property law and banking regulation his whole career. I don't know whether Nolan kept you up to date on his financial arrangements. I continued pressing forward without any fluctuation in tone. But I'll fill in the part he likely omitted. My forensic accountant ran the wire transfer down this morning. That $15,000 from Owen's Medical Trust didn't go to a clinic, a pharmacy, or a specialist. It was deposited into a commercial holding account to fund the lease on Amber's new retail storefront in downtown Westlake's Crocker Park district. Burton lurched back a half step, his heel contacting the baseboard behind him. "No!" he said under his breath, his head moving side to side in short, quick passes. "No, Amber had no part in this. She doesn't know anything about it. Amber's name is the only name on the LLC that holds the lease," I said, without any edge of anger in it. "The wired funds landed in an account registered to her. She has been financing a retail business with money stolen from a federally insured institution through a forged instrument built on my stolen identity. There is no version of this where she is a bystander." What followed was a silence that absorbed everything in the room. All that talk of corporate litigators and civil actions had evaporated completely. Burton's checkbook sagged in his left hand, about as useful as a torn receipt. He was a man who had built a career on reading the power in a room, and he could read this one perfectly. I was not the addled pushover grandfather he had driven through a storm to steamroll. I was the engineer who had just reduced his entire family structure to rubble. "If I carry this document and these wire records into a federal precinct," I said, holding his gaze without any movement in my face, "Nolan doesn't just answer for child endangerment. He faces first-degree wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. And Amber stands indicted right alongside him, co-conspirator accessory to grand larceny. Federal mandatory minimums on banking fraud run up to 30 years. Claudette broke. A raw, strangled sob tore out of her, and she grabbed Burton's arm with both hands. "Burton, make this right," she begged, every trace of aristocratic composure gone like smoke. "Tell him we'll put the money back. The full $250 today, whatever it takes." Burton was staring at me with the chest-caved, shoulders-dropped posture of a man who has just watched the ground disappear. The man who had barged across my threshold 40 minutes ago, projecting dominance and manufactured fury, was nowhere visible. "Clifton," Burton said, barely above a whisper, his voice gone thin and ragged in a way that made him sound a decade older than when he'd walked in. "Oh, Clifton, I'm asking you. They're not bad people. They are young, and they were reckless, and they made choices they cannot undo. But my daughter cannot go to federal prison. Please." I reached out and took the forged power of attorney from his unresisting hand. I folded it along the original crease and slid it back into my flannel pocket. "You walked into my house," I said, my voice unhurried and even, "and told me you would grind what's left of my life into dust. You promised to bury me in litigation to protect a woman who chained a sick little boy to the outside of a house in the dead of winter. You told me you were going to take my grandson." Burton's head was already moving, shaking in frantic little jerks, tears beginning to surface at the outer corners of his eyes. "I take it back," he choked out, both palms rising in open surrender. Every word, I take it all back. Clifton, please. Whatever you need from me, just name it. I studied the two of them standing there in my foyer, unmade afraid. Not one flicker of sympathy moved through me. They were standing inside the same terror, the same helplessness, the same suffocating loss of control that a 7-year-old boy had endured on a frozen concrete patio just hours before. Now they knew what it felt like. They had moved through their entire lives with the quiet certainty that enough money could absorb any consequence. It was time they learned that gravity operates independently of net worth. Your check isn't something I want, Burton, I told him, stepping back and closing my hand around the brass handle of the front door. What I want is for you to go home. Look your daughter in the eye and tell her that the old man she tried to break is the one holding the keys to her cell. Then wait for the call from the authorities. I swung the front door wide open, letting the full winter storm come roaring back through the foyer. Get off my property, I said. Burton and Claudette didn't threaten me. They didn't argue. They backed out through the doorway, clutching each other as the freezing wind cut across their faces, picking their way down the icy driveway toward the idling SUV. Two people who had just seen the shape of what was moving toward them. I stood in the doorway and watched until they reached the car. Then I pressed the heavy door shut, threw the deadbolt, and walked back into the quiet warmth of the house. The heavy oak doors of Cuyahoga County Family Court in Independence, Ohio, sealed behind me with a hollow, resonant thud that swallowed the bitter December wind whole. The hallways beyond had carried the familiar institutional scent of floor wax and recycled air, that antiseptic anteroom where lives get compressed into case numbers and sorted. But inside this particular courtroom, something heavier was pressing down on everything, the weight of a structure preparing to fail. I took my seat at the polished mahogany table, spine straight, breathing measured. Beside me, Sterling Quaid worked through his yellow legal pads with the quiet, focused stillness of a predator holding position in deep water. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. We had spent 48 hours pulling apart every financial transgression my son had ever committed, and what sat inside Sterling's worn leather briefcase was sufficient to bring the whole edifice down. But an engineer knows the discipline that detonation requires. You hold the charge until the target has walked fully into the center of the blast radius. I watched the heavy courtroom doors swing open. Nolan and Amber came up the center aisle, their footsteps swallowed by the thick carpet. They had clearly engineered their appearance with intention, dressed precisely for maximum judicial sympathy. Nolan wore a conservative charcoal suit, hair-pressed flat shoulders angled forward in a studied posture of parental grief and exhaustion. Amber had chosen a modest, high-necked beige dress, a crumpled white tissue held in one hand. Her makeup applied with careful precision to suggest eyes rubbed raw from sustained weeping. Together, they presented exactly the portrait they had rehearsed, a young suburban couple shattered by grief, loving parents from whom a volatile old man had torn their only child. Burton and Claudette settled into the gallery directly behind them, projecting restrained, wealthy indignation. When Nolan briefly caught my gaze across the aisle, he made an effort to hold it to project something resembling resolve. His eyes found the floor within seconds. They could not sustain contact with the absolute zero my silence put out. Judge Alford, a stern gray-haired woman whose bearing carried decades of family law, called the emergency custody and financial hearing to order. She settled her reading glasses and moved through the preliminary filings with an expression of sharply concentrated concern. What sat before her was not abstract. This was not the wire fraud proceeding or the forged mortgage case. Both of those would arrive in due course. This was the immediate raw contest over where my grandson would be sleeping tonight. Nolan's attorney, a polished, expensive corporate litigator named Hatch Dunmore, wasted no time and began covering the courtroom in manufactured tragedy. He called Nolan to the stand, and my son leaned toward the brass microphone and released a long, carefully timed sigh that moved through the silent room like a stage cue. "Your Honor," Nolan began, his voice carrying a rehearsed tremor that tightened every muscle along my jaw. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a meaningful milestone for our family. We were welcoming my wife's parents into our home for the first time. Everything was going well until my father arrived completely unannounced, visibly agitated and looking for a confrontation. He paused, pressing a single well-timed tear from the corner of his eye, then resumed spinning his account with a fluency that turned my blood cold. He claimed Owen had erupted into a violent tantrum at the dinner table, throwing hot food, screaming without stopping. He told the judge with the steady practiced sincerity of a man who had come to believe his own fiction that they had simply moved Owen to the enclosed back patio for a brief 5-minute timeout to let the boy settle himself. It was a lie of extraordinary smoothness delivered with such effortless conviction that it moved through the room like something almost believable. Nolan described how I had forced my way through their locked back gate, shattered the heavy sliding glass door without provocation, and taken his son before anyone understood what was happening. He sat under oath and wept, telling the judge that his elderly father had always been controlling, but had in recent months crossed into something dangerous and unstable. I sat and absorbed those lies as they echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. My mind went back the 8-degree bite of the frozen air on my face, the blue translucent color of my grandson's lips, the terrible stillness of his shivering body on that concrete, the absolute certainty in Dr. Colwell's voice in the trauma ward, confirming that Owen's airways had been severely damaged by months of deliberate medication withholding. Nolan stood a few feet from me, actively dismantling his own son's story to conceal the fact that he had drained $15,000 from a medical trust to fund an upscale retail storefront in downtown Westlake's Crocker Park district. A cold, dense pressure settled at the center of my chest. I did not interrupt. I did not object. Sterling sat motionless in his chair pen, resting above the legal pad eyes fixed on Nolan with a flat, unblinking patience that carried more threat in it than any outburst could have managed. I had told him, let them build the lie as high as it will go. The higher they raise it, the further it falls when it comes down. When Nolan finished his performance, dabbing his eyes, returning to his seat, reaching for Amber's hand, Attorney Dunmore rose and moved toward what he believed was the decisive strike. He approached Judge Alfred's bench carrying a thick manila folder, holding it with the solemn deliberateness of a man delivering something irreversible. "Your Honor," Dunmore said, his tone calibrated to project-practiced sympathy. "We recognize that Mr. Harwick claims he acted out of concern for his grandson's welfare on Thanksgiving morning. However, we have definitive evidence establishing that this was not a rescue. It was a violent abduction, the product of a tragic mental decline." Dunmore laid 2 documents flat on the polished surface of the judge's bench. "The first document, Your Honor," he announced, positioning himself so the full courtroom could track every word, "is a comprehensive pediatric evaluation signed by a private physician just last week. It certifies that Owen Harwick is in full physical health and has entirely outgrown his childhood asthma. There was no medical emergency on Thanksgiving morning. No daily medication was required. The grandfather was reacting to a healthy child having a difficult moment. My blood went cold. The audacity of it landed like something structural giving way beneath my feet. They had located a corrupt private physician willing to place his name on a legally binding document that erased Owen's chronic illness from existence, a clean paper burial of empty prescription bottles, and a documented medical history. But Dunmore wasn't finished. He turned slowly, directing one carefully manicured finger toward me. "The second document, Your Honor," Dunmore said, allowing each word to settle into the courtroom like slow-acting poison, "is a sworn affidavit from a licensed psychiatric specialist who reviewed Mr. Harwick's recent conduct. Canceled bank transfers, a shattered glass door, the forcible removal of a child over whom he holds no legal custody. The specialist has concluded that Clifton Harwick is exhibiting early-stage dementia characterized by severe paranoid delusions and episodes of aggressive behavior. The strategic architecture of it snapped into focus instantly. Nolan didn't merely want his son returned so the neglect could resume undisturbed. He was constructing the legal framework to neutralize the forged power of attorney Sterling had pulled from the bank records the night before. If I were declared mentally incompetent, a man acting out of paranoid delusion, every allegation I raised about a fraudulent $250,000 second mortgage would be dismissed as the confused noise of a deteriorating old man. Nolan was trying to take my grandson, my home, and my legal standing in a single judicial motion. Hatch lifted his eyes to Judge Alford, his face set with practiced gravity. "Your Honor, we are formally requesting that the minor child be returned to his biological parents immediately. Moreover, in light of the documented threat Mr. Harwick represents both to his own welfare and to those in his household, we are asking this court to order an emergency psychiatric evaluation and to vest Nolan Harwick with temporary legal guardianship over his father without delay." The jaws of the trap had snapped shut. Nolan sat at the plaintiff's table and watched me. He wasn't even trying to hide it. Satisfaction was carved into every feature. He was certain the fight was done. Those doctored medical records and that high-billing attorney of his had in his mind stripped away every weapon I carried. The machinery of a state guardianship was spinning up to bury me somewhere permanent and dark, my assets flowing quietly into his control. My eyes drifted to the forged paperwork sitting on Judge Alford's bench. Then slowly I turned and found Sterling Quade. Sterling Quade wore no trace of alarm. The opposing attorney polished expensive radiating menace from across the aisle didn't shake him for a moment. Sterling reached down, popped the brass hardware on his worn leather briefcase, and met my gaze with eyes that were calm and dark and promised something surgical. He didn't bolt upright in theatrical protest. He didn't raise his voice against the lies that had just settled like poison into the courtroom air. Instead, he came to his feet in one smooth motion, tugging at his cuffs with the unhurried precision of a structural engineer who has already calculated exactly where to place the charges. He glanced at Hatch, then at Nolan, and then gave Judge Alford his full and absolute attention. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice a deep, controlled baritone that reached the back wall without a syllable of strain. "We will not be offering a competing psychiatric assessment today. Defending my client against a diagnosis that was bought and paid for would be an insult to this court's intelligence and a waste of your time. My client's recall is fully intact. His cognitive capacity is without flaw. What he did on Thanksgiving morning had nothing to do with dementia. It was driven by a necessity so urgent it bordered on terror." Sterling's hand dropped to his side. The brass latches of that battered briefcase cracked open with two sharp, simultaneous snaps that sliced through the silence. He drew out a dense, stapled sheaf of documents printed on the formal letterhead of the State Pediatric Trauma Center. He crossed the floor in measured strides, delivering a copy to the bailiff for the judge and placing a second set squarely before a visibly rattled Hatch Dunmore. "Your Honor," Sterling said, working his way back toward our table at a deliberate pace. "Opposing counsel has introduced a private record asserting that this child is perfectly healthy, that his chronic respiratory condition has somehow resolved itself. What I am entering into evidence now is the official Cleveland Mercy Medical Center toxicology report, alongside the full blood panel ordered by Dr. Colwell, the pediatric trauma surgeon on duty that Thanksgiving morning. This panel establishes with complete scientific certainty that Owen Harwick's bloodstream has been free of his prescribed life-sustaining asthma medication for more than 4 months. He wasn't cured, Your Honor. The two individuals sitting across this aisle made a deliberate choice to cut off his air supply." Nolan went rigid in his chair, the performed grief evaporating from his face. Amber sucked in a sharp, shallow breath, squeezing her tissue until her knuckles blanched, but Sterling was already drawing the next charge from his case. He produced a high-resolution glossy photograph and set it gliding across the judge's bench, with the flat economy of a dealer turning a card. "My client captured this image at exactly 6:40 in the morning." Sterling said, his voice dropping several degrees in temperature. "What you are looking at is a 7-year-old child locked out on a concrete patio in 8-degree weather, clothed in nothing heavier than a thin cotton sleep shirt. Observe the frost that has built up across the glass of the locked sliding door behind him. Observe the color of his lips, severely cyanotic blue, deepening toward the dangerous end of the spectrum. The father just testified under oath that this was a routine disciplinary timeout. It was not. It was a calculated act of medical neglect, serious enough to push this child toward hypothermic shock and catastrophic organ failure." Judge Alford took the photograph in hand. The hard, weathered lines of her face drew tighter the moment her eyes landed on it, her gaze narrowing as the image did its work. She returned it to the bench with deliberate care, then turned that gaze on Nolan, and the weight of it appeared to press him physically into his chair. Before he could even begin assembling another lie, Sterling placed a compact black digital audio drive in the evidence tray. "Your Honor," he said, his attention shifting from the plaintiff's table to the gallery where Burton sat next to Claudette. "Opposing counsel would have this court believe my client stormed in like a violent intruder when he pulled his grandson off that frozen patio. What I am submitting now is a digital audio recording captured by my client in the lobby of Cleveland Mercy Medical Center. On it, you will hear Burton, the child's grandfather, offering a registered triage nurse a $50,000 anonymous donation to the hospital. You will hear him make unmistakably clear that every dollar of that sum hinges on the hospital's willingness to shred Owen's admission, records doctor, the toxicology findings, and shut down a mandatory police inquiry. Burton flinched backward in the gallery, as though the bench had shifted beneath him, his shoulders caving inward as the sound of his own voice captured, preserved and now entering the federal record forever registered on his face. The fine overcoat he wore had turned into something that looked more like a restraint. Claudette stared down at the carpet, her expression hollowed out by dread. Sterling let that silence sit and expand, letting the gravity of bribery evidence press down on the room, the way load bears down on a failing beam. An engineer understands you allow structural stress to build until the cracks climb high enough that everyone in the room can read them. Then he moved toward the bench, leaving the child suffering in the air behind him, and stepped onto the forensic financial ground where he was most dangerous. "Your Honor," Sterling said, his voice thinning to something razor-edged. "The father's position is that my client has deteriorated so badly he cannot handle his own affairs, much less a complex financial estate. I find that argument particularly interesting in light of a very detailed legal instrument Nolan Harwick signed exactly 90 days ago." Sterling drew the final manila folder from his case. He bypassed the bailiff entirely. He walked it straight to Hatch Dunmore and laid it on the table in front of him. Hatch was already damp at the collar, his attention bouncing desperately between the toxicology findings and the clients who were coming apart beside him. "What you are looking at," Sterling announced, his voice carrying the weight of a closing vault, "is a sweeping financial power of attorney purportedly bearing my client's signature, granting his son unrestricted dominion over a commercial real estate portfolio valued in the millions. The notary seal at the foot of that document certifies that my client was in full possession of his mental faculties when this transfer of control was allegedly executed." Nolan Harwick then leveraged that document to circumvent standard banking safeguards and pull a $250,000 second mortgage against a property my client owned outright without a penny of debt. Hatch Dunmore stared at the power of attorney. Whatever color remained in his face left it entirely. He moved his eyes from the signature to the notary stamp, then slowly up to Nolan, who had begun to shake in his seat in a way that could not be controlled. Sterling positioned himself over the table, crowding Hatch's space. His focus trained on the fraudulent document like a hawk that has already committed to the dive. "Counsel," Sterling said, pitched low, but with enough edge that the stenographer's fingers didn't miss a stroke. "Did your client tell you that he deliberately walked away from that $250,000 mortgage payment, engineering a bank foreclosure to strip his own father's property out from under him? Did he mention that at precisely 6:00 on Thanksgiving morning, while his son was slowly suffocating outside in the cold, he pushed through a $15,000 wire transfer drawn from a restricted pediatric medical trust? Sterling pivoted back to our table, hoisted a dense block of printed network security logs, and brought them down in front of Hatch with a thud that resonated through the floor. "These are verified IP logs obtained under subpoena directly from the financial institution," he told the judge, turning to face her. "They establish beyond any arguable doubt that the $15,000 set aside solely for Owen's respiratory treatment was transmitted from a smartphone registered in Nolan Harwick's name. The destination account is held by a commercial real estate firm operating in the Crocker Park district. Those stolen funds had gone towards securing the opening lease on an upscale retail storefront in the Crocker Park district of downtown Westlake, Ohio. The business registered entirely in the name of his wife, Amber Harwick. They did not steal a child, Your Honor. They stole from their heir to bankroll a fashion store." The courtroom dropped into a void of total devastating silence. The elaborate tragedy Nolan had erected just minutes earlier lay in ruins ground to powder beneath the undeniable weight of forensic fact. Judge Alford set her reading glasses down her hands, carrying a faint tremor of suppressed judicial rage. She took in the photograph of the freezing child, then the wire transfer records, and finally the expensive litigator who stood immobilized at the plaintiff's table. "Counselor," the judge said, her voice landing in the room like iron striking iron, "did you review this financial evidence and these medical records before you asked this court to hand your client emergency guardianship over the defendant's estate?" Hatch Dunmore rose slowly from his chair. Hatch Dunmore was a predator in a courtroom, but predators aren't reckless. He understood precisely what the Bar Association and a federal grand jury reserved for attorneys who knowingly fed forged government documents to a sitting judge. He grasped that he was now standing at the center of a federal fraud investigation and that FBI agents would be at his office door before the month ended. The expression he turned toward Nolan carried no confusion, no disappointment. It was pure, undiluted contempt. Nolan thrust a trembling, sweat-soaked hand in his attorney's direction, a mute, frantic grasp for a lifeline that no longer existed. "Your Honor." Hatch Dunmore's voice had been stripped of every courtroom flourish. What was left was something clinical and flat, the sound of a professional calculating how to survive the next 10 minutes. I had no knowledge of the emergency room toxicology reports. The audio recording documenting the grandfather's bribery attempt was never disclosed to me, and at no point were the power of attorney or the related fraudulent mortgage documents placed in front of me by my clients. They misled me repeatedly and deliberately about the actual condition of their finances and the true state of the child's health. Hatch Dunmore picked up his expensive gold fountain pen, then snapped the cover of his yellow legal pad shut with a crack sharp enough to pass for a gavel strike. His gaze stayed fixed on Judge Alford. He would not give Nolan or Amber so much as a sideways glance. "Your Honor, the evidence before this court-wire fraud document, forgery, perjury, all of it forensically documented, places me in an ethical position I cannot navigate around. Effective this very second, I am withdrawing as legal counsel for Nolan and Amber Harwick." Amber broke. A raw, heaving sob tore out of her as she buried her face in both hands, the last costly wall standing between them, and ruin had simply ceased to hold. Nolan had gone somewhere unreachable. His jaw worked open-closed, produced nothing. A man trying to draw breath in a vacuum. When his eyes eventually found mine across the aisle, what lived in them wasn't anger, wasn't calculation. It was the particular terror of someone who has just registered that the floor beneath them is no longer there. The version of my son who believed he could outmaneuver the man who raised him had evaporated without a trace. He was looking straight into the canyon he had excavated for himself, and the bottom was far closer than he'd ever reckoned. I gave him nothing, not a trace of satisfaction, not a trace of grief. I kept my spine straight, my palms flat on the mahogany table, and simply watched the wreckage come to rest. Behind me, the heavy courtroom doors swung shut on Hatch Dunmore's heels, with a soft, definitive click that sealed off the last exit. Judge Alford had not moved. She sat perfectly still at the bench, her gray eyes fixed on the empty stretch of floor where Hatch had been standing, as though something was written there that no one else could read. Her gaze descended to the forged medical documents Nolan had attempted to slip into the state record. Then it traveled across the forensic architecture Sterling Quode had constructed piece by piece before her. The wire fraud trail, the documented medical neglect, each element locking into the next with the interlocking logic of a load-bearing structure under calculated stress. The fury in her bearing was not rhetorical. It filled the room the way pressure fills a sealed chamber with nowhere to go. An engineer can tell you exactly what happens to a structure when forces exceed its design limits. Nolan was about to find out firsthand. Judge Alford called for no additional witnesses. She had no interest in hearing Nolan's version of events. She leaned forward, laced her fingers together, and rested her hands on top of everything Sterling had laid before her. When she spoke, the practiced neutrality a judge is trained to project was entirely absent. What came out was cold, exacting, and final, a blade, not a gavel. "Mr. Harwick." Her eyes locked onto Nolan and did not waver. "You entered this courtroom intending to strip an elderly man of his legal autonomy by manufacturing a diagnosis of cognitive decline. You attempted to weaponize the family court system as a cover-up device, one built to conceal that you deliberately withheld life-sustaining respiratory medication from your own 7-year-old child. You sealed that child outside in freezing temperatures so you could raid $15,000 from his medical trust and pour it into a retail business. And when the evidence began surfacing, you moved to bury it under fraudulent medical evaluations submitted to this court." Nolan's mouth fell open. Every last trace of color had drained from his face, and still nothing came out. Amber sat rigid as stone beside him, both palms pressed over her face, a low, unbroken sound leaking out from behind them. In the gallery, Burton and Claudette rose slowly from their bench. That polished, prosperous couple, the real estate developer, and the wife who carried herself like inherited money, had just watched their daughter and son-in-law dismantled piece by evidence that left no room for interpretation. They knew Burton's attempt to bribe the trauma nurse was now a labeled exhibit in a court of law. They understood their own fingerprints were on this wreckage and that the damage was still spreading. So, they did what people like them always do. They offered their sobbing daughter, not one word turned their backs, and slipped quietly out of the courtroom, preserving what remained of their reputations, the only way they knew how. When the structure starts to give, wealthy cowards don't reinforce it. They step off it. Effective immediately, Judge Alford announced, bringing her gavel down, with a crack that closed every remaining door. The parental rights of Nolan and Amber Harwick are hereby revoked. All physical and legal custody of the minor child, Owen Harwick, is stripped from you both. Full permanent guardianship is awarded to the grandfather, Clifton Harwick. An immediate restraining order is also in effect. Neither of you may come within 1,000 feet of the child or the grandfather. Breach that order, and you will be taken into custody on the spot. Amber folded over the plaintiff's table, her body shaking apart with sobs. The judge had not finished. I am directing the bailiff to impound the entirety of the documentary record presented today. Judge Alford's voice carried the authority of someone who had already decided and was now simply informing the room of the outcome. The IP logs, the forged power of attorney, the hospital bribery recordings, all of it goes directly to the district attorney's office for federal criminal review. This custody proceeding is adjourned. I would strongly advise you both to retain criminal defense counsel without delay, because the state intends to file charges well within the week. She rose, passed through the door to her private chambers, and left behind a silence so complete it had physical weight. The civil fight was finished. For my son, the criminal accounting was only now drawing its first breath. Sterling Quaid snapped his battered leather briefcase shut, 2 clean, unhurried clicks, and began stacking his files with the calm of a man who had known for weeks how this afternoon would conclude. I didn't move from the mahogany table. I sat and watched the full measure of what I had constructed come down on the boy I had spent a lifetime raising. Nolan shoved his chair back and got to his feet. The contemptuous, self-assured man who had tried to cage me inside his legal scheme was nowhere to be found in that room anymore. He crossed the center aisle with the unsteady gait of someone whose legs hadn't yet received the message from his brain. His cheeks were streaked with tears that had nothing performed about them. He stopped a few feet short of me, trembling the way a structure trembles when the wind it was never engineered to bear moves through it. "Dad, please!" Nolan's voice fractured on those 2 words. "Dad, you have to stop this. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. They're going to put us in federal prison. We're going to lose everything. I'm your son. Please, every cent of that $15,000, I'll return it. The boutique closes today if you say the word. Just call your attorney off and tell the judge this stays between us." I held his gaze and drew a slow, even breath. There is something almost clinical about watching a predator discover that the trap it assembled with such meticulous certainty has sprung on its own leg. He was thrusting my love for him forward like a piece of armor, trying to make a father's feeling absorb consequences his own hands had built. It doesn't work that way. A father's love is not an unconditional line of credit that never runs dry. A well you spend years contaminating does not purify itself the instant you arrive at its edge, desperate and thirsty. I came to my feet unhurried and fastened the button at the front of my jacket. 2 fingers went into my breast pocket and returned with a single sheet of heavy legal paper folded at the center. My voice stayed level. My expression gave him nothing, no fury, no satisfaction, not a flicker of either. The look I gave him was the look an engineer gives a collapsed span, diagnostic, impartial, complete. Then I laid the document on the table between us and stepped back, leaving it directly beneath his shaking hands. "There is nothing here to negotiate, Nolan." Not a tremor in my voice. "You're correct that you're about to lose everything, but your timeline is off. You lost it already." He dropped his eyes. Fingers that hadn't stopped trembling peeled the fold apart. His gaze traveled across the heavy black text running along the top of the page. This was no offer of compromise, no gesture toward reconciliation. It was a court-stamped notice of eviction effective at once. Those bloodshot eyes climbed back to mine, hollowed and hunting for a surface to grip. "What is this?" Barely enough air behind the words to carry them. "The machinery you set running 90 days ago." I said, watching comprehension moved across his face like a tide. arriving at the only destination it ever had. 90 days ago, you forged my name on a comprehensive power of attorney. You fed my stolen identity into the bank's verification system and extracted a $250,000 second mortgage from the equity in that colonial house. Every dollar went into offshore accounts to fund the life you wanted. Nolan swallowed and shifted back a half step, as though the paper itself had burned him. Your plan was elegantly simple. I went on keeping my eyes locked on his and not releasing them. Missed the payments deliberately. Let the foreclosure process roll forward on its own. Because the deed is in my name alone, that fabricated debt would settle entirely onto my shoulders. You would have stripped my retirement down to nothing, put me out of my own home, and walked away with the cash in your pocket. Effective, Nolan. Genuinely effective. But your blueprint had one load-bearing flaw you never accounted for. Across the room, Amber had gone quiet. She sat rigid watching us, the color retreating from her face in stages as she pieced together the systematic unraveling of every scheme she'd believed was invisible. The moment a mortgage tips into serious default, the lending institution is required to contact the primary name on the note. I let that land the way a cold front lands quietly, completely leaving no warm air behind. The bank identified the missed payments and reached out to me several weeks ago. I didn't walk their fraud unit straight to your forgery. I waited. I let the arrears stack up until the account crossed the threshold that formally initiates foreclosure proceedings. Then this morning, while you were buttoning that expensive suit, rehearsing your performance for the bench, I went to the bank. Nolan's head was moving in short, tight shakes, his body resisting what his mind was beginning to accept. I settled the full outstanding balance with my own reserves. I said the last component of the mechanism clicking into alignment. That cleared my legal path to acquire the debt outright. And because my name has always been the only name on that deed, your deliberate default gave me standing to proceed against you as a secondary occupant. I foreclosed on you, Nolan. Emergency eviction order filed this morning on grounds of fraudulent hostile tenancy. The judge's signature went on it 2 hours ago. No, the word left Nolan like air escaping a punctured line. He drifted backward until the gallery rail stopped him. That's not possible. Everything we have is inside that house. Our clothes, our furniture, everything. And none of it is yours anymore. I told him no warmth in it at all. While you sat at that table performing grief for the court, the county sheriff was executing the order at the Colonial House in Westlake, Ohio. Every lock on every exterior door has been rekeyed. The garage codes no longer function. A moving crew went room by room, pulling out your furniture, Amber's designer clothing, and every item bought with misappropriated money, and stacked it all on the curb outside in the snow. Amber didn't compose herself or cover it. What came out of her was a raw, tearing scream, nothing rehearsed, nothing held back. She grabbed her bag and ran, heels cracking against the floor tiles in a frantic beat as she sprinted down the corridor, racing to reach whatever the storm hadn't already buried. Your vacation at that address is over, Nolan, I said, turning back to face what was left of my son. The boutique isn't an option either. Sterling locked the commercial holding account, which chains your stolen $15,000 directly to the lease agreement. The property management company is already moving to reclaim that storefront on fraud grounds. And you won't find shelter with Burton and Claudette. They left this building a few minutes ago, knowing full well that a federal indictment is on its way, and they have no intention of letting your name pull theirs under with it. Nolan let go of the eviction notice. It turned in the air and settled to the carpet. And then he went down with it, both knees on the center aisle, every last structure holding him upright, giving way simultaneously. His face went into his hands, and what came out of him was the gutted, inconsolable weeping of someone who has just felt the true depth of the hole he dug. You set out to build a premium life on a foundation of forgery, calculated cruelty toward your own child, and the financial ruin of the man who raised you, I said, looking down at him. No pity in it. You assumed you could hollow me out and discard me once I'd been emptied. But any engineer will tell you when you remove what is holding a structure up from below, the collapse lands on whoever pulled the supports away. There is nothing left for you, Nolan. Every beam of this wreckage has your handprints on it. I turned my back and walked away. Sterling Quaid lifted his briefcase and fell into step beside me. We covered the full length of the aisle together, leaving Nolan folded on the floor of a courtroom that had already forgotten him, and I pressed through the heavy doors into an afternoon that was cold and sharp and flooded with light. The storm was gone. The sky above was clear, hard, and very blue. I pulled the freezing air into my lungs and recognized something I hadn't felt in a long time. A deep structural steadiness settling back into place. The corroded framework had been taken all the way down. There was nothing left of it to excise. The drive back to Columbus, Ohio, was waiting back to the warm house, back to my grandson, and something new could finally begin to be built. Something designed to outlast everything that had just come down. The quiet that followed the judge's exit didn't survive long. A handful of raw seconds and then the eviction order and the approaching federal charges ignited the room. The image Nolan and Amber had constructed, two devastated parents wrongfully accused, came apart all at once. Amber unraveled first. She remained at the plaintiff's table, eyes fixed on the court order that had stripped away her colonial house and placed everything she owned in the snow outside. She couldn't catch her breath. The arithmetic of where she actually stood was arriving in her mind quickly, and none of it was survivable. The boutique had been capitalized entirely from the stolen $15,000. The commercial lease bore her own limited liability company's name. It was becoming ferociously clear to her that federal investigators examining this case would not classify her as an innocent party who didn't understand what her husband was doing. They would classify her as the principal beneficiary of the stolen medical trust money and of the fraudulent $250,000 mortgage drawn against her father-in-law's property. Amber looked at Nolan. Whatever had been powering the heartbroken mother performance burned out on the spot. What replaced it was the caged feral rage of someone who has just registered that every route out has been sealed. She shoved back from the table hard enough that the chair legs shrieked across the floor and went for Nolan without hesitation. Her voice hit the vaulted ceiling and bounced back down, piercing completely stripped of the careful restraint she had maintained since morning. A trembling manicured finger drove toward his chest as she announced to the courtroom that the forged power of attorney belonged to him alone. She said loudly, her voice climbing, with every word, that she had never been told a single detail about the identity theft or about the second mortgage he had secretly pulled against his father's home. What he had told her, she insisted, was that the money flooding their accounts had come from a legitimate private commercial loan. Every word she screamed was a wall she was trying to construct between herself and the federal indictments closing in on them both. Nolan lunged for her hands, desperate to silence her, to cut off the flood of public confession before it submerged them both. He pleaded with her in a frantic, urgent whisper to stop, pointing out that the court stenographer was still at her post, capturing every syllable for the permanent state record. Amber wrenched his hands away with open contempt. She announced she had no intention of walking into a federal penitentiary for crimes born entirely of his recklessness and self-interest. Without a heartbeat of hesitation, she fed the father of her child directly into the path of the coming prosecution and stepped clear. She cried out that she was an innocent victim, that she had been deceived and manipulated by a sociopathic liar. Those words rang off the courtroom walls and settled into the official record like concrete. In the gallery, Burton and Claudette watched their daughter's implosion with wide, stricken eyes. Burton was a veteran commercial real estate developer, a man who had outlasted rivals for decades by knowing with cold precision exactly when a failing asset needed to be cut loose. He studied the forged documents on the evidence table and calculated the blast radius with practiced efficiency. If the FBI launched a full audit of Amber's newly formed LLC, the money trail had destinations he could not allow federal investigators to reach. They would subpoena her lease agreements, her banking records, her corporate contacts. Burton grasped that the moment he directed so much as a single dollar toward his daughter's legal defense, federal prosecutors would immediately broaden their focus to scrutinize his own substantial holdings. This contagion was too dangerous to touch. Amber turned away from her collapsed husband and stretched her arms toward the gallery, imploring her father to intervene. She begged him to release his corporate attorneys, to repay the bank the $250,000, to make the criminal exposure disappear. Burton did not extend a hand toward his weeping daughter. He stood completely rigid, his expression hardening into a cold, impenetrable mask of total self-preservation. He looked at Amber and told her, his voice stripped of every ounce of paternal feeling, that she was a grown woman who had signed a fraudulent commercial lease entirely of her own volition. He made certain to pitch his words loud enough for the armed bailiffs stationed near the doors to register that his development firm had absolutely no connection to her retail boutique or to her husband's illegal banking operations. Claudette released a choked, agonized sob and moved toward the heavy wooden gallery railing, reaching for her daughter. Burton seized her arm with bruising force. He pulled his wife back toward the center aisle, physically steering her away from the wreckage of their child's life. He told Amber flatly that she had constructed this situation herself and would be living in it without his assistance. He was not prepared to watch his spotless commercial empire come apart because of her criminal exposure and insatiable greed. Burton and Claudette turned their backs on the courtroom and walked out through the heavy double doors, leaving their daughter weeping on the floor, entirely abandoned by the wealth and privilege she had arranged her entire life around. Nolan watched his in-laws vanish, the last surviving thread of his social ascent, severing as the doors swung shut. He looked at his wife on the carpet, openly engineering her separation from his very existence. His expensive, aggressive attorney had already cleared the building to protect his own license. Nolan had no house, no money, no legal defense, and not a single family member left to draw upon. The structural collapse was complete. Every parasitic connection he had spent the better part of a decade carefully building had torn itself free rather than be dragged into the pool of federal prosecution. He stood stranded and utterly isolated at the center of a life he had taken apart with his own hands. Nolan turned his head slowly, his gaze moving across the aisle to the polished mahogany table where Sterling Quaid and I sat in quiet observation. His eyes carried the hollow, terrifying blankness of someone who has finally registered the full, irreversible weight of what he set in motion. The arrogant, entitled man who had stormed into Cleveland Mercy Medical Center in Westlake, Ohio, demanding my arrest, who less than an hour earlier had tried to seal me inside a legal and psychological cage, was entirely gone. He lurched forward, knees threatening to give under the accumulated mass of his own destruction. He halted a few feet from my table, trembling the way a fractured column trembles when the load bearing down on it has finally exceeded what it was built to carry. He looked at me with tears running down a pale, wrecked face and begged for a second chance. His voice broke apart on the words as he promised to return every single cent of the stolen $250,000. He promised to shut the boutique down immediately to find a second job, to do whatever it took to make the family whole. He swore he would enter counseling. He swore he would become a different man. He swore he would never disrespect me again. I remained in my chair and watched the ruined figure standing in front of me. I heard each desperate promise and understood with complete certainty that they amounted to nothing more than the hollow reverberations of a coward trying to outrun the gravity bearing down on him. There was one critical element missing from everything he said. He offered no apology for locking his 6-7-year-old son in a freezing space to suffocate. He produced not a syllable of genuine remorse for keeping life-sustaining respiratory medication out of a vulnerable child's system for months. He did not apologize for attempting to have me declared mentally unfit, or for scheming to leave me bankrupt and homeless in retirement. He was sorry for one reason only: the mechanism had closed, and federal prison was now in his direct sightline. His anguish was manufactured. Self-pity dressed as contrition. I offered him nothing. I did not raise my voice or allow a flicker of vindictive satisfaction to show. A structural engineer does not debate the settling dust once a condemned structure has been safely demolished. I met his eyes with the absolute freezing stillness of total detachment. I let the silence between us accumulate into something vast and unbridgeable, a canyon he could never cross again. He had stopped being my son the instant he placed a dollar value on my grandson's life, and no measure of weeping could ever reconstruct what that had destroyed. I rose from the mahogany table and fastened my suit jacket with slow, steady hands. I looked at Nolan one final time, long enough to be certain the permanent void in my eyes reached him long enough for him to understand the silence would not be broken. Then I turned away from him completely. I took my coat from the chair and walked toward the main exit. 2 armed bailiffs moved in at once, setting firm, authoritative hands on Nolan's slumping shoulders and blocking any further approach. Nolan broke entirely, his knees hitting the carpeted floor with a dull, heavy impact, as a raw, wrenching cry of absolute despair tore out of him. The bailiffs hauled him back upright, holding his struggling form as he thrashed and pleaded for a father who was no longer there to hear it. I moved down the center aisle at a steady, measured pace, my footsteps carrying the quiet rhythm of reclaimed ground. Sterling walked directly beside me. His battered leather briefcase held firm at his side, the documentation inside it, securing my grandson's safety permanently. We passed the crumpled, weeping form of Amber and the desperate, struggling figure of the man who used to be my son. We pressed through the heavy doors, stepped out of the sterile purgatory of that courtroom, and left the complete ruin of their lives sealed permanently behind us. The brutal winter that had marked the darkest chapter of our lives had long since yielded to the easy, forgiving warmth of late May. I sat in my rocking chair on the back porch, listening to the familiar creak of the wooden runners on the floorboards. The ice that had once threatened to drain the life from this property was entirely gone, replaced by the deep, vibrant green of new grass and the soft sound of heavy oak leaves turning in the afternoon breeze. The air carried damp earth and blooming honeysuckle, a world apart from the sterile chemical smell of the pediatric trauma ward that had lived inside my memory for months. A structural engineer understands that the true measure of a foundation is not simply how it endures the force of a storm. It is how it settles and stabilizes once the ground finally stops shifting. My home had stopped shaking. The structural integrity was fully restored. The heavy steel deadbolts and the perimeter cameras Sterling had put in place during the height of the legal battle were still operating, but the feeling surrounding them had changed entirely. They no longer carried the atmosphere of a structure under siege. They felt like permanent, unbreakable boundaries holding everything toxic exactly where it belonged on the outside. At the far edge of the yard, near the heavy wooden fence I'd built with my own hands, my grandson was chasing a bright yellow rubber ball. Owen was running, not stumbling, not stopping every few steps to clutch his chest in desperate, gasping panic, just running his small sneakers, kicking up bits of fresh grass, while he laughed out loud. That laughter was the most beautiful acoustic resonance I had ever registered. I tracked the rhythm of his breathing as it drifted across the open yard. The terrifying shallow rattle that used to echo out of his damaged lungs was entirely gone. What had replaced it was the deep, clean intake of a healthy 7-year-old drawing warm spring air into his chest without the slightest effort. His condition was fully managed now. It required no $15,000 withdrawals from a trust fund, no fabricated emergency trips to distant winter clinics. It required only a grandfather who remembered to hand him a simple daily inhaler and cared enough to schedule honest, routine pediatric checkups. The weeks immediately following the emergency custody hearing had been difficult. Owen had been gripped by severe night terrors, waking in a scream, because some part of him believed he was still trapped on that frozen concrete patio. I had spent night after night in the armchair beside his bed, holding his hand and telling him the cold would never find him again. Gradually, the fear receded. He had gained 8 pounds since the judge granted me full permanent custody. The pale, translucent fragility that had lived in his skin was gone, replaced by the warm color of healthy circulation. He was flourishing in a home where he was treated as a child, to be loved and protected, not a noisy inconvenience to be pushed out the door while his parents poured wine. On the small wooden table beside my rocking chair sat a thick envelope bearing the embossed official seal of the state district attorney. It had arrived with the morning mail, but I'd felt no urgency to open it. I let it sit there for hours, working through a mug of black coffee and the newspaper, before finally breaking the heavy paper seal. The legal document was now unfolded across my lap. The language on the page was clinical, sterile, and absolutely final. It was the formal sentencing notification for the federal and state criminal proceedings against my former son and his wife. Nolan and Amber had attempted to negotiate a plea arrangement, casting themselves as overwhelmed young parents who had stumbled through a string of regrettable financial missteps. They had tried to weep before the federal judge exactly as they had wept in family court, but Sterling Quaid and the federal prosecutors had made certain no such mercy materialized. The irrefutable forensic record, the forged power of attorney, the traced wire transfers. The medical toxicology reports had reduced their defense to powder. The document confirmed that Nolan Harwick had been sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary on multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and banking forgery. A consecutive state sentence for severe child endangerment had been appended, ensuring he would not breathe free air for a very long time. Amber Harwick had been sentenced to 8 years in a federal facility for her role as a willing co-conspirator in the grand larceny, and for her explicit complicity in the life-threatening medical neglect of her own biological son. The letter outlined the substantial financial restitution orders as well, though that money was largely beside the point by then. The upscale retail storefront in the Crocker Park district she had dreamed of opening had been seized and liquidated by the federal government before its doors ever opened to a single customer. The commercial property management company had sued them both into permanent absolute bankruptcy, and Burton, the arrogant commercial developer, who had once stood in my foyer and attempted to purchase his way out of a felony investigation with a silver pen, had suffered a catastrophe of his own. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation turned its attention toward his daughter, their forensic auditors swept inevitably across his entire corporate operation. Burton had spent decades shaving corners, bribing municipal zoning officials, and falsifying commercial property valuations. The intense media exposure surrounding his daughter's federal indictment sent his wealthy investors into a panic, and they pulled their capital overnight. His empire folded into rubble, taking his arrogant threats and his fine overcoats down with it. Claudette had filed for divorce to protect whatever assets remained in her own name, leaving Burton utterly destroyed. They were all gone. Every parasite had been cut cleanly and permanently from the structure of my life. I lifted the heavy legal document from my lap. There was no surge of vindictive satisfaction, no trailing shadow of paternal grief. What I felt was the calm, quiet equilibrium of a perfectly balanced equation. I rose from the rocking chair, with the paper in hand, crossed to the heavy-duty shredder, positioned in the corner of my home office just inside the sliding glass doors, and switched the machine on. I listened to the low, steady mechanical hum of its motor. I fed the district attorney's letter into the metal teeth and watched as the names of my son and his wife, the details of their prison terms, the official state seal were methodically drawn down and reduced to hundreds of meaningless paper ribbons. I pulled the plastic bin from the shredder, carried it to the kitchen, and emptied the shredded remains directly into the trash alongside the morning coffee grounds and discarded eggshells. They were no longer a threat. They were no longer a tragedy. They were simply refuse. I moved to the kitchen stove and lit the front burner. Though the spring weather had turned warm, Owen and I had developed a late afternoon ritual we observed regardless of season. I poured cold milk into a small metal saucepan and watched it warm slowly over the steady blue flame. I stirred in 2 spoonfuls of rich dark cocoa powder and a pinch of nutmeg, the wooden spoon tracing slow, deliberate circles. The sweet, warm smell filled the kitchen, displacing whatever trace of the past still clung to the air. I poured the steaming chocolate into 2 heavy ceramic mugs, then dropped a handful of mini marshmallows into Owen's cup, knowing precisely how he liked them, to soften and spread across the surface. I carried both mugs out through the sliding glass doors and onto the wooden deck. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon, throwing brilliant gold and orange light across the green lawn. Owen. I called, my voice carrying easily through the quiet yard. Come up to the porch, the cocoa's ready. Owen stopped running and turned toward me, his face breaking into a wide, breathless grin. He scooped up the bright yellow rubber ball and sprinted across the grass, his small feet thumping up the wooden deck stairs. He did not wheeze. He did not cough. He simply let out a happy, worn-out breath and reached up with both hands to take his mug. "Thank you, Grandpa," he said, his voice clear and bright. "You're very welcome, Owen," I replied, settling back into my rocking chair and resting my mug on my knee. "Be careful, it's still hot." He nodded, blowing softly across the melting marshmallows before taking a careful first sip. Then he climbed up onto the wide wooden porch railing and swung his legs back and forth, looking out over the yard. I sat beside him, drinking my cocoa and watching the sky shift gradually from a clear afternoon blue into deep, vibrant bands of orange and purple. The neighborhood was quiet, no aggressive calls demanding money, no arrogant visitors arriving to threaten my home. There was only the sound of wind moving through the trees and the steady, healthy breathing of the boy next to me. An engineer knows you cannot raise a lasting structure on a foundation assembled from lies and entitlement. When the underlying rebar has rotted through, no volume of expensive finish work or luxury detailing can hold back the collapse that is coming. You have to bring everything all the way down to bare dirt, clear out every piece of toxic debris, and begin again with materials that are actually built to endure. I had cleared the debris. The boundaries were absolute and unbreakable now. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. Truly. I don't take lightly that you gave this story your time. Looking back on everything, The courtroom, the cold morning. I found Owen on that patio, the months of careful, quiet preparation. I won't pretend it didn't leave marks. There are things a father should never have to see his son become, but I believe God doesn't let the truth stay buried forever. In my experience, when you do the right thing with patience and precision, the accounting eventually comes. It may be slow, it may cost you more than you expected, but it comes. If these grandpa revenge stories and father stories have taught me anything worth passing on, it is this. First, protect the child in front of you. A child's safety is not a family matter to be handled quietly. It is a legal and moral obligation. Act on what you see. Second, document everything silently and early. Confrontation feels satisfying in the moment. Evidence wins in the room that matters. Third, when someone hands you a weapon they think is pointed at you, let them believe it until the moment arrives to redirect it. Patience is not weakness. It is architecture. Fourth, love does not mean accepting what someone does to those in your care. You can grieve a relationship and still hold the person accountable. Those two things are not in conflict. If this story moved you, I'd be glad to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, a grandparent, a parent, a friend carrying something heavy, please pass it along. Subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge so you don't miss what comes next. These stories matter, and so do you. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.